his veins. On the contrary, she had treated him as a threat to her children and any grandchildren she might have had. But that was no fault of his own. On the contrary, he had treated her with the utmost respect, more than any other bastard might give to the wives of their fathers. But she had given him no hugs when he was afraid, or reassuring words whenever he had a nightmare, or any approval whenever he did something well. No, only her husband had ever done that, and whenever Ned had asked her to do the same she had refused. She simply hadn't cared for him, not for a single moment. She had tried to get him sent far away from Winterfell when he was a babe, and when her husband made his desire to have him legitimized and landed known, she tried to talk him out of it. First trying to talk him out of legitimizing the boy in the first place, and then trying to get him to at least land him far away from Winterfell in a weak holdfast, so that he might never be able to bear steel against Winterfell. And every time her husband had refused, and the mere thought of what she had done made her feel ill to the core. And here it was, every year and every moment she had refused to be a mother to Jon, shown all in a single second in front of her, in that single callous act of the Schwulf abandoning her pup to die and utterly unfazed by it. The mother and the father will never forgive me for what I have done. They could forgive a woman who didn't want to be a mother to a bastard, to a boy who had no mother of his own, but not one like me, not one who tried to talk his husband out of treating him like a son, or one who tried to have her children treat him as a rival and not as a brother. Gods have mercy, what have I done? She swallowed hard, looking away from the others as she did. She couldn't bear the thought of what she had done, what she was doing, what horrible things she had done in her refusal to be his mother. I can't do it anymore. Not after that. He might not be my son, but neither are any of the others at Winterfell. None of them are my sons, but I have been a mother for them when I wouldn't be one for him. She had to change. She could see it as clearly as the sun at the breaking of dawn, but how? How could she treat him as a son, when she had treated him so poorly for all those years before? Could he ever forgive her for what she had done? Could she ever forgive herself? Uncle, you cannot arrive soon enough. I have never needed your advice as much as I do now. Help me make right the things I have done wrong. Eddard nodded to his bastard son, to her failure, to Jon. I will have Gage keep some milk warm for whenever he needs it, and have an extra blanket in your chambers to keep him warm at night. She couldn't even look towards her beloved husband when he spoke anymore. Thank you, Father Jon replied with a grateful smile, the smile a loving son would give to his father. She hadn't even needed to look towards him to know he was wearing it. I best go to the kitchens. The heat will do him good, and he needs something to eat just as much as I do. Her husband led the way towards the kennels with Rickon's pup in his hands, Jon leaving them for the kitchens as soon as they left the Godswood. It was almost time for dinner, she knew, but she hadn't an appetite, not after what she had seen the Schwulf besides her do, not now that she realized what she herself had been so quick to do all those years ago when her husband had come home to her after the war and shown her his bastard son, so small and helpless just as the pup was. When they reached the kennels, her children talking amongst themselves with excitement as she stayed silent. When they reached the kennels, Farlin was waiting for them, with the largest of the kennels opened wider than she had ever seen it before, filled with furs for them to sleep on and plenty of water for whenever it might be needed. They built these to hold direwolves, Lord, he said with an eager smile. It only took a little work to make them able to hold them again. Well done, Farlin, her husband began as the Schwulf walked inside entirely of her own accord, as if she knew Catelyn never wanted to see her again. Jon has a pup of his own, the smallest of the litter, but she's rejected him. Lord, she'll be like to do that if he's the runt. So long as he keeps him fed and warm, the pup will be all right. Can we visit our pups? Arya asked excitedly as she set hers down just past the kennel's gate, the Schwulf walking over and picking up the tiny pup and carrying her across the room to the corner where she lay upon the rough but warm skin of a northern cow. For a little while at most, but it'd be best not to. Farlin began. If she's rejected one pup already, even if it was the runt of the litter, she might well reject any of the others. Not if I can help it. My Lord Maester Lewin said with only the highest respect as he shuffled towards them from his tower, holding a letter sealed with golden wax and stamped with the crowned stag of their king, Robert Baratheon. A raven came for you not long ago. Eddard passed the pup to Farlin and took the letter from the Maester as their children passed their pups to the Schwulf to let them rest for the evening. He snapped the golden seal and read quickly, starting with a smile as he read the words of his old friend, a smile that quickly fell away as his expression turned somber. "My lord, what is it?" she asked, seeing the pain on his face. "The hand of the king is dead," he said grimly. "I am sorry, my lord. I know he was like a grandfather to you." Her husband sighed as he finished reading the letter and folded it back up. "King Robert rides for Winterfell, and he will be here by the time the moon turns again. He must mean to name my husband his new hand. Has my uncle joined his party?" "Aye, he has," her husband replied. "And Tywin Lannister rides with him." Asterisk 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 asterisk. End of part 15. Chapter 16, Joy. Notes. Well, it took longer to get here again than I had expected. Cold sweat, but regardless, here we are with the next part of the story, starting on the roads towards Winterfell. Now, it might take me a little while to get my footing again, but not long, I assure you. Now, let's get going. Laughing smiley. See the end of the chapter for more notes. Chapter text. Asterisk 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 asterisk. A month later, not far south of Winterfell. Joy Hill sighed with a shiver as she shifted in the seat, glancing out the shuttered window of the lavish wheelhouse and seeing nothing but rolling plains of grey-green grass and an overcast sky full of thick clouds that the sun's light struggled to penetrate. Her eyes lingered on the seemingly perpetual twilight that bathed the northern lands of the Seven Kingdoms, the sun never quite seeming to truly shine in the way that it did in the south and in the west, nothing like the north where even the cold nights felt as though they were darker. It looked every part the grim land full of grim people that the stories and singers made it out to be, and made the bright colors of the royal retinue stand out all the more. Sir Barristan Selmy in his brilliant white cloak, riding alongside on a white destrier, his armor gleaming in the little light there was as though it were made of solid silver. King Robert Baratheon not far past him, the towering demon of the trident in his enormous sail of cloth gold and black that fluttered softly in the gentle winds, her cousin Jaime not far, shining in his golden armor, all three men and all the other knights and lords and ladies of their party the most colorful things in the land, from her to the horizon. Only the thud of the wagon rolling over a lump in the road could break her gaze towards more colorful surroundings, and only the painful jolt it sent up her spine could snap her attentions back to the gold and crimson interior of the Queen's wheelhouse, a place as lavishly decorated as any castle and bigger than the house of any peasant farmer, full of all the luxuries that a queen might need on her travels, masterfully constructed, but even here the cold of the outside could find its way in. Somewhere, through the narrowest opening of a door or the tiniest crack in the floor or wall. All around her were the women and young of the royal family, and their closest and most trusted attendants. Cersei sat on the other side of the table that dominated much of the wheelhouse's first floor, a glass of wine in hand and a thick fur around her shoulders to protect her from the biting cold, next to whom was her only daughter, Myrcella, contentedly passing the time by practicing her needlework, sewing a great beast with two heads, one a lion and the other a stag, and opposite her was little Tommen, too young to ride such a great distance on his own without the risk of falling from his saddle, happily reading a tome that Maester Pycelle had given him to improve his reading, the saga of Eldrick Shadowchaser, a northern hero who had fought the others in the long night, a story of burning swords and powerful sorcery. "See anything interesting?" Princess Myrcella asked with a smile and a curious voice, taking her attentions from her sewing at last. "Not this time," she said truthfully. Sometimes there were interesting sights on their way to Winterfell, sometimes passing through towns and villages that dotted the countryside, or through meadows full of those furry cows the Northmen were fond of, even a merchant caravan on its way from one place to another or a recruiter of the Night's Watch and their band of rangers and recruits would sometimes pass them by on the road, but this time, there was nothing. "I hope it isn't much further from here to Winterfell," the princess replied. "Do you really think it will be as big as the Northmen say it is?" "It is," the Queen said simply, taking a sip of her wine. "You have been to the north before?" Myrcella asked with surprise, turning towards her Queen Mother. "Once, with your great-uncle Kevan and my brother Jaime," Cersei continued. "It was long before you or Joff were born, before Robert became king." "How come?" Myrcella asked again with a freedom that Joy wished she could have. "Bastard girls don't talk to princesses unless spoken to." "Did grandfather send you?" "Of course he did," Cersei answered. "It was to see if my brother Jaime might take a liking to the Stark girl, Lyanna. Wasn't she father's betrothed before she died?" "She was, but not then, Circe said at last before taking another sip of her wine. It would have never worked anyway. Your uncle would have taken the black before having her as his wife. She was more a man than a woman, and neither of them had liked one another much either. Do the Northmen have burning swords? Tommen asked with excitement. Like Eldrick did. For a moment, Joy thought Circe was about to sigh or slump back into her seat from the question, but instead, she leaned forward with a mother's smile. Not anymore, sweeterling, but once. And with nothing more said, Tommen burst into an excited laughter and went back to his reading, his mother smiling a little more after that. Circe was Joy's cousin, the beautiful and true-born daughter of her uncle Tywine, and nothing at all like a bastard. She was proud where Joy was humble, fierce where she was meek, and outspoken where Joy was quiet, as was proper for the natural daughter of a spare son. But Joy did not envy her, as no one cared whenever a hill or a snow made a mistake, as it was expected of them to do so for not having the blessing of the mother and father, for not being conceived in a wedding bed, but a true-born Lannister had no such fortune. Even if the uncle that had raised her had taught her to be ever careful of the errors that she might make, she knew that any mistake she made would never be able to be used against her father's family, only against her, and even then not for more than a few hours or days at most, not like with Circe, whose failures would be seen as weakness of her family and talked about for years, decades or even centuries to come, long after either of them were dead, and even so much as speaking with the small folk would be enough to raise frightful rumors for a woman of her station. But for Joy, how could they, when she was half peasant herself? Her Lannister blood might have meant that she was to hold herself to higher standards, as she did, but it was not enough to get her the splendid treatment that a true-born maiden from her house might have, and in that way, she was a bastard of two families. She was neither truly high-born or low, with the nobility disliking her for being a bastard and not of a truly noble blood, ignoring her except for the times they needed to speak with her or give their courtesies, whilst the common did so for her having a privileged upbringing in the first place, even if it was not the same as that her true-born kin. It did not bother her much, not anymore, not since her uncle Tywine had told her how the world worked and the reason why she was treated the way she was when she had become old enough to understand, and why he would look after her even with the stain of bastardry besmirching her character, as family should, and the only question she might have had was whether or not her future husband felt the same. She already knew who it was that she was supposed to marry. Her entire visit to the north was to try and arrange it, that she had been made very clear on, but she couldn't help but wonder if the bastard son of Lord Eddard Stark, Jon Snow, would be like her. Would he be accustomed to waiting on his true-born relatives, kept from their games but also similarly excluded from those of the common children? Would he be used to eating not at the dais but on the low table, surrounded by those who envied his station without realizing what it meant? Would he be trained and prepared for the role of a nobleman, but never given the responsibilities such an education was for? The life of a bastard was a lonely one, but perhaps it might not be so lonely after all, and the thought of not being alone for once filled her with as much a feeling of comfort as it did unease for what the future might hold. What if he was cruel and hateful to her? What if he was planning to go to the wall and take the Black or cross the narrow sea to become a sellsword? What if he was already planning to marry someone else? She did not know, but she knew that bastard boys were the masters of their own fate in a way that no one else ever was, with all the freedom of any nobleman but none of the responsibilities, and that meant she might do everything that was expected of her exactly right and still go unwanted and unwed. Such thoughts were troubling, but not for a moment did she let it show. It was not proper for a bastard to show or express their feelings and views unless asked, after all, and she was nothing if not a proper young lady, fully aware of all the things that were expected of her. She could sing well, she could sew and dance even better, she could handle numbers and a household best of all, and though she was still a girl of 10 and a few years away from her own flowering, her guardian uncle had seen fit to have her accompany a midwife for a week, and so she knew exactly what happened in a birthing bed, the pain, the mess, the magic, the joy, the sorrow. She had seen all of it and she had learnt. With all that, she was ready for anything the world might bring against her, whatever surprises it had in store for. Crack! The timbers groaned and the wheelhouse shuddered with a loud crunching, before finally rocking hard and shaking all those within before striking the ground with a bang with a flurry of thuds from the floor above, not a single piece of furniture upon the ground floor moving from the places where the carpenters had hammered them down. Hells! Not again, the king shouted towards them, the entire retinue coming to a halt. Circe! Out! That wheelhouse of yours has broke another damned axle. Circe seemed to sigh, then, setting her cup upon the table before rising from her seat and putting on another thick fur passed to her by a handmaiden even more quiet and unnoticed than Joy herself before starting towards the door, followed first by Myrcella and then Tommen and then Joy herself, the cold air of the world beyond the wheelhouse rushing in and chilling her before a servant brought over her own coat, a thick brown garment made from beaver pelts that stretched down no further than her waist before being replaced by red wool, able to keep her warm in the cold of the north even if it was not quite so fine as Circe's fresh fox pelts. Another servant, this one a young man with neatly groomed dark hair and a tunic of black and gold cloth and thick leather breeches, kneeling down in the road with a large wooden step in his hands to ease their exit from the crippled carriage. As before, Circe stepped down first before turning towards her brother Jaime, dismounted and amused, and the heir to the throne, the gold-haired Prince Joffrey that stood besides, horses not far away. Then her children went next and went off towards their uncle Tyrion, talking amongst themselves, laughing quietly about the things they might say, and at last, Joy stepped down from the wheelhouse with short graceful movements, onto the road of damp grey cobblestone, still moist from the last time the summer snows had covered its surface only to melt under the rise of the afternoon sun, and rather than follow either the queen or her children to one of her cousins or the other, she moved to the side of the road, not stepping off into the mud but staying upon the edge, distant from those who mattered and those who might take affront to her presence, quiet, but watching. The attendants of the wheelhouse, those who looked after the horses and knew how to maintain and repair the carriage, rushed over with a number of wooden blocks, stacking them one by one on the broken side of the carriage, using them as a means to take the weight whilst they mended the broken axle, only for the blocks to slip and slide on the wet stone whenever the weight was put on them, unable to grip the smooth surface, leaving the servants helpless to raise the wheelhouse on their own. The king laughed at the sight, unfastening his cloak before throwing it into the hands of Lancel Lannister, his squire, revealing an armored body so great in stature as to look as if the warrior himself had stepped down from the heavens to come to their aid, a large giant 6.5 feet tall, sharply groomed and strikingly handsome, towering over every other man in the party, even her uncle Tywin and her cousin Jaime, tall men both. Clegane, over here, he commanded, flexing gauntlet hands as the hound came to his command with a quiet grumble, Robert then turning his attentions to the servants. Place the blocks beneath once we raise it up enough for you to place them. The servant nodded quickly, and just so, Sandor Clegane and King Robert Baratheon lifted the corner together with a heave and a groan, shifting the weight of the carriage so that it could stand on its 3 intact wheels without slumping over again. Quickly, the servants placed the blocks atop one another, stacking them to full height so that when the king let go again, the weight was distributed across all 4 corners of the wheelhouse, allowing them to finally start removing the broken axle. At that moment, a shadow passed over her with the sound of a horse walking to a halt, and she turned around to see her uncle, Lord Tywin Lannister, in travelling clothes of red and gold rather than armour like the king, sat high upon the saddle of his mount. She relaxed instantly, whatever discomfort she might have for being around people so far above her station disappearing in a heartbeat. Her uncle Tywin had taken on the task of raising her when no one else would after her father disappeared on his search for Brightraw, when even Joy's own mother had stopped caring for her and left, never to be seen in Casterly Rock or Lannisport again, not because of any love for her father or out of a sense of duty, but because she was family, and that was the only thing that mattered, even if she might have been an infant bastard girl at the time, someone who might give only a little to the Lannister name through her existence even once she was of age. For that, she loved him like the father she had never had a chance to know. "Uncle, why does the king travel in his armor?" she asked, allowing herself to speak first. "Other than the king's guard and a few of his retainers, almost everyone else are in their travel clothes, and it doesn't seem as though it would be proper for everyone to wear something so different from their king. His Grace has always been known for his skill in battle, no doubt he finds himself more comfortable traveling in plate than he does in cloth," Tywin answered. As for it not seeming proper, King Robert has always had little interest in setting trends of fashion, but if he so desired he could say a word and have every man in the realm of any importance in plate. "All the more reason that I should count my fortunes," then Joy said softly, a smile hint of mild amusement in her voice. "She leads the entire realm in what to wear, and having her like only one kind of dress and one kind of shoe makes it easier to fill my wardrobe without emptying my coin purse." "You jape, but that is so," Tywin said with all seriousness. "It is the king and his queen who make the fashion of the realm, them and no other. My daughter prefers Mirish lace to Nephi silk or Lorathi velvet, and so every maiden in the realm dreams of having a gown of Mirish lace, and King Robert likes his Dornish reds, and so everyone who can afford it has a bottle of Dornish red in his cellar. I wonder if the Stark girls will be wearing southern fashions, Joy said with a curious tone. They will most likely not, Tywin answered, his voice so certain as to make the words he spoke become facts. The Starks of Winterfell rule the largest realm out of any of the crown's vassals, and have enough power to be more of an ally to the throne than one of its subjects. They will have heard of the crown's tastes and chosen to wear them or not, and the latter is more likely as my daughter's tastes are for the warm springs of the south, not here where it still snows in summer. It's amazing to think that they have managed to build a realm here, Joy said, glancing towards the west where she saw a small hamlet on the horizon that had not been able to see from the inside of the carriage before, a place of some 24 houses that was surely one of Winterfell's outlying settlements or something of the sort. It is so cold here that it snows almost every other day, and water freezes at night to ruin fruit, huddling beneath her coat for warmth. How did they do it, uncle? How do the wildlings survive beyond the wall? Tywin countered, unfazed by the cold winds. How do the Dornish live in a place that rarely rains and has little water? How do the Lhazareen do it, when their fields and villages are burnt by Dothraki Khalasars every week? People adapt to the lands around them, niece, and the Northmen found a way to live here. No doubt they would ask the same question if they were in the mountains of the Westerlands, trying to find out how we grow enough food to last through winter. There was a question in her throat, pleading to be asked and yet weighed down by the risk of speaking out of turn, even in front of her cherished uncle. He noticed it on her face, however, even despite her best attempts to veil her true feelings, and said more softly, "You may speak, Joy. Is it true that my cousins came here when the Targaryens still ruled?" Joy asked at last. It is her uncle started. Times were different, then. But the Lannisters of Casterly Rock and the Starks of Winterfell have been close friends for nearly 300 years, but even before Aegon's conquest, Stark and Lannister ships had worked together to keep the Ironborn at bay, just as they do now, a hammer and an anvil to smash the Iron Islands on should they decide to break the King's peace once more. The friendship between the North and the West has long been something from which the entire realm has benefited, however, with Lannister gold helping to pay for the canal that the Northmen built and with Lannisport benefiting the most from its construction. "This is why you are to marry the Stark bastard," Tywin said at last. "There are only 3 great powers in this realm, and 2 of them together can make or break a king. My own father, Tytos, somehow managed to see that through his cups of wine and saw fit to marry your aunt to the Lord Darkstark, earning our family an influential friend in the Northlands. But it is known that the Lord of Winterfell cares a great deal for his bastard son, and it will be your marriage to him that will make the Starks into our ally. So, Joffrey is here to find a bride to support the crown, and I am to marry the Snow to make an ally for the Westerlands," Joy said with understanding. "That means the Baratheons, Lannisters and Starks will all be bound together in one alliance." Then she saw the tiniest flutter in his cheek, the slightest hint of the smile that never quite was. "Exactly so," Tywin said with a nod of approval. "You may not have the Lannister name, but you have a Lannister's blood and a Lannister's wit." "Thank you, uncle," she said with a small smile and a slight bow, ever grateful for his approval. "I owe it to you." Before her uncle could speak with her again, there was the soft clamoring of the wooden blocks being kicked away, the wheelhouse standing upon its own wheels once more, and the king laughed heartily as he remounted on his black palfrey, Stoacloud, a large horse for a large man, and gave a shout with a powerful voice that could be heard even in the rear of the royal retinue. "Come on, then. Ned'll start to wonder if we're even coming if we take much longer than we already have." In response to the king's command, the caravan began preparing itself to move once more, with trusted servants and the high-born men of the party helping the women not so fortunate as to be able to ride inside the wheelhouse onto their horses before mounting their own, Sir Barristan Selmy escorting the Queen and her children back towards the wheelhouse whilst Sir Jaime stayed with Joffrey, the 2 already on their own horses and ahead of Sandor Clegane with his terrifying hound-faced visor. Raised upright and Sir Brynden Tully even further behind, alongside the main body of the retinue and with his own personal crest, a black trout, clearly visible upon the surface of his cloak even from where Joy was standing. But before she walked towards it, before she waited on the Queen once more, she turned towards her uncle, silent and waiting. "You may go," Tywin said at last. But remember, your cousin has given you an opportunity to speak with her and her children in the wheelhouse and make powerful friends. You would be best to make use of it. Of course, uncle, she said in acknowledgement before turning towards the wheelhouse once more, walking with a smile before returning to her demure veneer as the queen ascended the wooden steps back into her carriage once more, followed first by Myrcella and then little Tommen, the same order in which they had disembarked, before Joy took her first step, gripping the small golden handrail that was part of the door for support as she stepped back inside the lavish carriage and made her way over to her chair, only sitting down again after her cousin Circea had, as was proper, taking the chance that her uncle had suggested to use, she went against her instincts and spoke first, as only a true-born should, careful of her wording. Your Grace, since you have been to Winterfell before, would you say that we are not far from the city? We aren't, thankfully, Circea answered, picking up her wine cup from where she had left it as the carriage began to roll forward with the voice of a servant, a crack of a whip and a neigh of a horse. The hills make it seem as though we are further away than we really are. Half an hour, or an hour full at most, so long as we do not break another axle on this road. Thank you, Your Grace, Joy said with a grateful nod and a smile. And thank you again, for being so generous as to allow a bastard girl like myself to ride within your wheelhouse. It is an honor to be with you. And just as Tywin had once told her that nothing pleased his daughter more than flattery, the Queen Circea smiled, taking the tiniest sip of her wine, like a proud lioness lapping up water, certain of her position and in the fealty of the ones around her. You are welcome, cousin Circea answered at last. Your father was always my favorite uncle, just as he was Jaime's. He would be proud to see you as you are now. Are you looking forward to meeting your betrothed? I do, but I wonder what kind of man he will be, she said, her words truthful. He won't be a Southron knight, that I know, and he will be a bastard like myself, but for all our plans of marriage I know so little about him as to only know his name and who his father is. I knew little more about my own husband when I was told that I was to marry Robert, Circea answered, Myrcella slowing down her sewing to listen curiously in on the talk of marriage and weddings. I had met him before, at Harrenhal, but he was more interested in his own betrothed then, the Stark girl, so we hadn't talked to one another much. But after the rebellion, she was dead and the new king was in need of a bride, so my father wed me to him, and all I knew about him then was that he had overthrown the Mad King and never lost a battle. Is that really all you knew about father when you were married? Myrcella asked with amazement. No. Time spent learning about each other before the wedding. Like in the songs. Life is no song, sweeterling, Circea said warmly, before answering more fully. But no, the first time I saw him since Harrenhal was at the wedding. There was no time for anything else, as Robert had needed to wed quickly. It was to help bring the realm back to peace after the war, to make things start to seem normal again, Joy added for Myrcella, Circea nodding to her daughter in agreement. Will I have any time to speak with my betrothed? Once I have one. Myrcella asked, the combination of curiosity and unease clear on her young face. I don't want to marry someone I don't really know. You will have as long as you might like, and not even your father will be able to say otherwise should he try and wed you off to someone you do not want, Circea replied, Myrcella letting out a sigh of relief as she relaxed into her chair and began sewing once more. Nor you, Tommen. Will father fight the others if they come south? The youngest of the royal children asked, looking up from the hefty book. The others are gone, Tommen, Circea answered. But what about their spiders? Slain, if they ever existed at all. And their ice dragons. The singers added those to make the stories seem more heroic, Joy said, the queen laughing softly before taking another sip of her wine. All the best heroes slay dragons. Like Cerwyn of the Mirror Shield. Like, father. He slayed a dragon. Tommen laughed. A dragon prince. Didn't he, mother? Didn't he? And he won't ever stop talking about it, Circea sighed tiredly, no one more familiar with the king's proud boasts and war stories than her. No doubt he will feel the need to tell the tale 100 more times once we reach Winterfell. Still, I do wonder, Joy said at last, thinking. Have you any news at King's Landing about what Jon Snow might be like? Or what his father might mean to do with us once we are wed? The Northmen have always liked to keep to themselves, Circea mused, raising her glass for another drink. They would be happiest of all if the rest of the realm was water and the northern island in the sunset sea, so that they might sit in their snow alone and drink their ice wine without needing to bother themselves with anyone else. They have little interest in the goings-on of the South or of King's Landing, so long as it doesn't affect them, and Robert doesn't mind it, either. 7 Know how much he loves Starks. He would let them have the Riverlands as well as the North if old Lord Tully and his son died. As for his father's plans, she said, tilting her glass slightly, eyeing the crimson liquid within, I suppose he will give your husband what most other Stark bastards seem to get, a castle, mayhaps a village or two for income and a crest to call his own. Oh. You can be called Lannisters, Tommen said with excitement, glancing up from his book. Joy and John Lannister. Joy was tempted to shake her head at the sound of that potential name, but resisted. Mayhaps I will ask him to consider it, she said, glancing towards her cousin with a look in her eye that said it all. Tywin Lannister would never want it, and neither would Joy wish to insult him in such a manner. I hope our cousins are at Winterfell, Joy said at last, smiling as she remembered the last time they had met. Her Aunt Jenna had brought her children to Casterly Rock the year before, so that they could meet Prince Joffrey for a feast in celebration of his 12th name-a-day, and Joy had made sure to meet them all whilst she had the chance. Her aunt's husband had stayed behind, but all his children were there, the dutiful sailor Roderick and his 3 children, Linora, Benjen and Joanna, the first 2 of whom were near enough her own age, the brave Tiget and his dreams of being as great a swordsman and hero as his cousin Jaime, and the pretty twins Adra and Lion, the one lustful and daring and the other quiet and ever so shy, and not because of the desire to act proper and according to her station, either. She had gotten along with all of them splendidly, especially Lion, with whom she had bonded over their shared nature of staying away from the attentions of others, but there had been one child of Lord Byrne and Lady Jenna that she had not been able to grow close with, and it was their second-born son. Between Roderick and Tiget, Edric, a bastard girl like Joy was not meant to be a judging person, never. But in her heart of hearts she felt that there was something not quite right about him. Something wrong inside, and made sure to stay well enough away. The Northmen liked to send their children to Winterfell as wards of the Starks, so they might be there, Cersei explained at last. Not all of them, but some. Does King Robert know that you know so much about the North? Of course not, Cersei smiled. He likes surprises, so I think it is only right he gets one once we arrive. A greater surprise than seeing Uncle Tywin paying a toll at Moat Cailin. Cersei laughed, then, proper laughter, and even her children did the same at the memory of their grandfather having to pay for his own passage into the north, as well as for those who were part of his retinue rather than that of the royal one. With a family name like Swampstark, it would be easy to think that the holders of Moat Cailin were simpletons or mud-wearing madmen. But in truth they manned the battlements of the North's first and last line of defense, a fortress upon which the Andal invasion itself had smashed like glass, and such fierce tenacity was shown by Lord Eddard Swampstark, Lord of Moat Cailin and Protector of the Causeway, that it was not hard to imagine man and castle alike being one the same, a pair of stalwart guardians who would never be conquered by any Southron, but who would gladly bend their knees and tip their banners towards the North to whom they were kin, and no better was that shown than in how he had the strength of courage to make the most powerful lord in all 7 kingdoms pay a toll to cross beneath his gatehouse, despite the king to whom he had a marriage alliance being present alongside, despite over a dozen gold lion banners fluttering overhead, and despite the Lion of Lannister's fearsome reputation. Then he had taken the Lord Lannister's coins with neither humour nor pride nor anything of the sort, but the way a tax collector might go to a market and collect his lord's due, completely businesslike in manner and completely unmoved by Sir Jaime's suggestion to duel the best sword the Swampstarks had to offer for free passage if he won or a doable fee if he lost, as well as Tyrion's attempts to reason with the Lord Swampstark about all the benefits of having the Lord of Casterly Rock as a friend. None of it would move him in even the slightest, and in the end the man had got his due and the royal retinue had feasted in the halls of Moat Cailin and spent the night there, the king laughing at it all the morning after as they continued their northwards journey to Winterfell. I would hope so, Cersei said at last, sipping her wine again and extending her cup out for a handmaiden to fill, the serving girls having followed Joy into the wheelhouse before it began to move again. He still thinks Winterfell is just a castle and not a city. I see no reason to spoil the surprise. Is he the only one who doesn't know? Myrcella asked with a curious but playing smile. Most of them haven't ever been to the north before, Joy answered. I think we're the only ones who know. And I hope to keep it that way till we arrive, Circea said with a gleam of mischief in her emerald eyes. It will be more entertaining this way. 7 hells, came the king's laughing shout from outside. When did he get the damned time to build that? And here we are, Circea said at last, raising her cup for one last sip before their arrival. Winterfell. Can I take a look, mother? Myrcella asked, her mother nodding quietly before the princess rose from her seat and turned towards the frontmost wall of the wheelhouse, where a small wooden step allowed her to rise up to the level of a small wooden slit in the wall, a viewport covered by a small wooden slat that was pulled to the side to make an opening through which light and fresh air could pass, or closed to keep the cold at bay, and at almost the instant she peeked through the opening, wincing at the bright light of the outside world, she laughed. It's huge. I never thought it would be so large. May I? Joy asked hopefully. Of course, Myrcella smiled, returning to her chair and quickly starting to explain everything she had seen to her younger brother, who was still too small to see for himself, but Joy paid little attention to that, hearing her speak and yet not hearing the words, instead standing to see Winterfell for herself, with eyes that were familiar to the sight of the great city of the west, Lannisport. What she saw was beyond her expectations, both her lowest and her highest. Instead of the tall wooden wall atop a high rampart of earth or the stout barrier of cobblestone with a stake moat that she had imagined to surround the northern capital, there were massive and proud walls of thick grey granite, mighty forms of masterful masonry that was unequal to any in the south and well maintained, too, with every melon and every embrasure on every section of wall that her eyes could see in fighting condition, with even the little ports below for where the hoardings might be attached in times of war, ready for their timbers to be inserted with little trouble, above great red runes that stared back at her like the crest painted upon a knight's shield. Then there were the towers, not small and spidery things of wooden logs or crumbling fortifications of mismatched stone, but grand structures just like those on the walls of Lannisport or any other great city, cylindrical in form with cross-shaped holes in their surface from which the scorpions within could be aimed and fired at any attacking force, even against siege towers, and on every tower she saw a cone for a roof to protect the men inside from the harsh snows and biting winds, thin and daggery direwolf banners fluttering in the winds above just as a man in a dark green robe walked below, a water cart close behind, a priest blessing the fortifications to stand strong in the face of storm and siege, though what the water was for she could never know. Ahead of her on the path of the road was a gatehouse, a small castle in itself, so high and wide as to be able to accommodate the passage of the royal wheelhouse without much difficulty, a major feat in its own right, as more than a few other castles had needed the great carriage to remain outside the walls lest it smash into the ceiling whilst trying to pass inside, and more than any other the gatehouse was the clear heart of the defence, flanked by 2 towers larger and more fortified than any others she could see, twice as wide but just as tall, trading the conical roofs of their comrades in exchange for catapults able to crush any attacker beneath a hail of stone boulders or a barrel of burning pitch and tiny rocks no bigger in size than her thumb. But above it all, beyond it all, atop a large hill that would have once been home to a ring fort of the first men, was the citadel of Winterfell itself, a magnificent fortress with taller walls and taller towers and an immense square keep of the same grey granite blocks as the rest of the castle, only larger, an entire fortress of them, the largest castle she had ever seen in her life other than for Casterly Rock itself. Greater than the Golden Tooth she had passed on her eastwards journey, greater than Riverrun when they had stopped at it for the night before meeting up with King Robert's retinue, greater than Raventree Hall and its huge black wood, greater than the ruined seat of the Mud Kings at Old Stones, greater than the shield of the Riverlands that was Seaguard, and greater than the dual river crossing castles of the twins. All of them were like young boys compared to a man full grown, and it was obvious from even where she was that a lack of space had been no consideration of the castle's builders. No, they had all the room in the world to make a strong fortress, and the sight of it reminded her more of the stories and tales she had heard of Highgarden than not. But unlike Highgarden, when the wolf-faced gate opened to allow them to enter inside the walls, there was a city within, a wealthy city where the houses were large and the roads covered in stone, where veritable flocks of eagles soared above and landed on the rooftops, watching as the king raised his hammer hand as a clenched fist, as if he was holding it over his head, bathing in the chant of the crowd as they shouted his name with what could only be the sound of adoration, and 100 other names the Northmen had for the man who had been their closest ally, Robert Ruber Crusher, Robert Prince Secula, Robert Dragonslayer. All of them were words that she heard shouted, and all of them were words the king welcomed with a grin and a boisterous laugh. As strong as a direwolf, she murmured under her breath, echoing words that her uncle had once said to her years before. And as good to have on one's side. "Are you going to stand there till we reach the castle?" Circe asked with amusement. "Sorry, Your Grace," Joy said apologetically, returning to her seat, and leaning close towards the shuttered window, so she could see the crowds passing by as the carriage rolled along. "They do love our king. He is the first king to have visited Winterfell in years," Circe dismissed. "They would cheer the Mad King Aes or Baela the Blessed if either of them were the one on that horse instead." Joy nodded in understanding, and noticed something odd amongst the crowd, for as the king passed them by and the wheelhouse rolled along, people seemed to gawp at the one who rode behind, and she knew that was Tyrion Lannister. And as she looked out amongst the crowd, she noticed something else. There were no dwarfs here. Not a single one. "Your Grace," Joy asked with concealed surprise. "Why are there no dwarfs here?" "This is the north, cousin," the queen answered. "What do you think a mother does to her deformed child, when the cold winds rise and the snow falls thick? When one mouth too many might mean an entire family could starve and die in winter time." Joy looked back at her royal cousin, then, with cold realization. "You mean they?" "Of course they do," Circe replied with a low voice and an understanding of their reasoning. "Only the highborn can afford to have dwarfs here. For a small folk, they are burden. Have you ever heard Maestas tales about the time of the first men, cousin? How their clans lived? Every time a babe was born, their father would pluck them from their mother's breast and look them over, looking for deformities that might weaken the clan," the queen said as she eased into her chair. "If they saw them, they would make it quick, I imagine. So they wouldn't suffer." Tommen and Myrcella were visually uneased by what their mother had said, the young prince more so than his elder sister, but to Joy, it made sense. Hard and fierce places like the north and the lands beyond the wall meant that the people there were hard and fierce also, entirely capable of making hard choices that would seem abomination in easier and softer lands and peoples, and if the choice was between having a useless dwarf, a mouth that would need to be fed but one who could not hunt to feed others or build shelter or craft tools, or having no such dwarf and having more food to go around for healthy children who would be able to grow up into strong and healthy men and women able to do such things, then the choice was clear, wasn't it? That the dwarf should be sacrificed for the good of the clan. That the needs of the many must come before that of the one. Then why did her uncle look after her, when no one else would? Joy wasn't so sure about the ancient Northmen killing their dwarfs, now, yet alone the present ones doing the same, but she set the thought of the dark matter of the past aside and recomposed herself to focus on the matters of the present, for the time she would meet her betrothed. She did sums in her head to soothe her nerves, and went over the words she would say to him the way a mama might recite their lines for their time on the stage or how a knight might practice their slashes for a coming battle, and rubbed her hands over one another, warming her cold fingers before finally sliding her hands into a tiny pocket in the side of her dress, the place every lady has to keep their coin purse and other small items, before pulling out a tiny mirror with a good quality reflection, albeit with a surface no larger than 3 inches across. Despite the stain of bastardry and the curse of having a low-born mother, she still looked more like a true Lannister than not, if perhaps more like a Lannister of Lannisport than a Lannister of Casterly Rock. Her hair were thick shoulder-length curls of sandy blonde and her eyes were a dark shade of blue, compared to Cersei's golden locks and emerald eyes, a look that had removed any doubt as to who was the most beautiful woman in all 7 kingdoms years before when she had first become Robert's queen not long after the end of the rebellion. With the touch of the back of her fingers, she moved a small curl of hair that had fallen out of place in the winds of the outside world back into its proper place, examining herself more closely to make sure that everything was perfect for when she met the one who might be her future husband, her dress and coat in particular, and she smiled as she saw that aside from a few small creases, there were no marks or other such things that could spoil her looks, no small stains of wine or specks of dirt or anything of the sort that could risk embarrassing her or her family in front of the king and the lords of the north. She glanced at herself in the mirror again, putting on a truly ladylike expression, that of a delicate and innocent but beautiful maiden, the look that the statue of the maiden herself had in the September of Casterly Rock, a small and gentle smile. And then, at last, she felt a jerk beneath her legs and feet as the carriage rolled to a stop again, this time under the driver's command, the clattering of horses' hooves coming to a stop. "And we are here," Cersei said at last, rising from her seat once more, her children swiftly following and heading towards the door just as they had before, only this time in a far more formal manner than before, and one that Joy made sure to mimic, appearing entirely certain of her actions on the outside even if she was still fearful of a mistake inside. Then the door opened, the wooden step already in place. Sir Jaime Lannister stood beside to help them dismount. Air that felt a dozen times colder than it had been outside the city rushed inside, the oil lamps that lit the wheelhouse flickering from the sudden gust of cold just as she shivered beneath her dress and cloak, Joy biting down beneath her delicate smile in order to mask her discomfort. She walked along as elegantly as she could, following the Queen and her children out of the wheelhouse and down the steps and onto the courtyard, taking her cousin Jaime's hand to help her down, where the grey eyes of 100 Northmen were on her, standing near her cousin and yet apart, closer to her uncle Tywin than not, and all this in deathly silence, the entire courtyard so quiet that not even the birds were making any noise, yet alone the great numbers of Stark men she saw all around her. Men at arms on the battlements and at the foot of the castle's own walls, vassal lordlings and young maidens who had been raised alongside the Stark's own children, all of them from the eldest boys who were almost men grown to the youngest girls still years away from flowering into maidens, all were on one knee with their eyes facing towards the ground beneath them, and so were the Starks themselves. The dark-haired Lord of Winterfell knelt alongside his lady wife and all his children, his 3 sons and his 2 daughters all there in the order of birth, from eldest to youngest, and the bastard Snow was there too, and just like her and her family, he was stood a little further away than the true-born children, but close by all the same, looking towards the ground like them and unable to see her, but she could see him and she saw a man who was his father writ small, with the same brown hair, the same shape of body and even the same shape of face, from what little she could see of him. He was young, only 4 years older than Joy herself, with all of the lankiness and leanness that came with a boy growing into a man, but from him her eyes fell to the small dog beside him, an animal of white fur and red eyes, different looking from any dog she had ever seen before, in a way she could not truly place. Was this a wolf when it was still a pup growing? Perhaps even a direwolf, even. Her maester and her septa both had told her that such animals were long gone from the world, like the Targaryen dragons were, but if the north was remote enough to keep a great city such as Winterfell hidden from the rest of the world, then perhaps they too were wrong. Whatever attention she might have been able to pay to him was turned towards the king, however, as the towering Robert Baratheon dismounted his horse and allowed a serving boy to take the reins and lead it onto the stables, striding over towards the kneeling Lord of Winterfell like a demigod walking amongst mortals. He stood in front of him then, quiet, looking over his vassal lord for just a moment before speaking. "Rise," the king said, and rise the Stark and all their men and wards did, climbing to their feet once more with a clamour of feet and the clatter of armour and the flutter of cloth, something that let her see that Jon had the same grey eyes and the same long face of his father, too. "Your Grace," the Lord of Winterfell started with a low, respectful and entirely formal voice, echoing through the tense and quiet courtyard as only a solitary voice could. "Winterfell and all its hospitality is yours." For a moment, there was silence again, the king considering his words. "You got fat," the king said, glancing at the Lord of Winterfell's middle. "I came," the Stark's grim reply. And then there was laughter, and the 2 men hugged like long-lost brothers, and whatever unease there was in the air faded in an instant. A throng of servants came through the retinue, then, carrying wooden boards covered in clay bowls full of hard and almost cracker-like bread and shards of finely milled sea salt, the traditional offerings of a lord providing guest right, and every man and every woman in the royal retinue took their piece, with even Tommen making sure to take a piece of both, if perhaps small ones for his youth. With that, the king clapped the Lord of Winterfell on the shoulder. "Where in the hells did you get all the time to build this, Ned? You never mentioned having a damned city." "We Northmen are humble," your Grace," Lord Eddard Stark answered with a bow of his head. "You could have told me when we were in the Vale," the king laughed, giving the Lady Stark a warm hug. "Cat. A pleasure to see you again, your Grace," Lady Catelyn Tully answered as the king let her go. And on the king went, to the eldest true-born son of Winterfell, a young man of the same age as his bastard brother, only with his mother's looks rather than his father's. "You must be Robb." "I am, your Grace," the heir of Winterfell answered, bowing in fealty before shaking the king's hand firmly. "An honor." "You might look more like your mother," the king said, "but I'll be damned if you don't take after your father." Robb laughed, then, only to fall silent again and straighten himself as his lady mother glared, and so the king went on to the next one in order, Eddard Stark's eldest daughter. And you must be Sansa. I am, your grace, the young Stark maiden answered, giving her king a curtsy. It is a pleasure to meet you. Mayhaps you will wed my son and join our houses in alliance, the king said warmly, only for the Lady Sansa to stare back at him the way a doe might its hunter, only to look towards her mother and father the moment the king walked over to the younger pair of Stark children, King Robert crouching down in front of Eddard's second true-born son and daughter. And who are you two? The king asked with a smile. My name is Arya, the young girl said, before adding, almost as an afterthought, your grace. Joy couldn't help but think how long she would be punished for such a slight. A month. A year. A decade. But the king simply laughed, seeing exactly what kind of girl she was from the mistake, and mussed her hair before turning his attentions onto her brother. And you? Brandon, your grace, he said with a practiced voice. An honor to meet you. My father told me how you killed Rhaegar with your hammer. Did he now? Robert asked, smiling as he looked towards his friend before turning his attentions back towards Brandon. What say I tell you and your brother's war stories after dinner? He wasn't there at Summerhall, and gods, what a battle that was. We smashed 3 armies in a single day there, one right after another. Brandon seemed to go almost wide-eyed at the king's offer, and nodded quickly. The king rose to his feet, and then looked to see the great crowd of brown-haired and grey-eyed Northmen and Northwomen, amazed. Gods be good, Robert murmured as he looked over the collection of northern youth, an army of noblemen and women gathered for him to see, lowering his voice for the first time since their arrival. Are these all yours, Ned? Joy almost laughed, then. These are my wards, your grace, Eddard explained, turning his hand. It is tradition for the lords of the north to send some of their children here to Winterfell, so that they might grow amongst those their own age and those who will someday rule the north alongside them. Well, greetings to you, the king said, laughing as he shook every hand that could reach him. Then, when every greeting was done, when there was nothing else to do, all the joy seemed to go out of the King of the Seven Kingdoms, who was famed for his jovial, and he met Lord Eddard Stark's eyes, and whatever it was that the Lord of Winterfell saw in them, it killed whatever joy he might have had from the king's arrival, and replaced it with an aching grief. I would like to pay my respects, Robert said at last, saying nothing more. From there, the Lord of Winterfell simply nodded, and the two men walked off together. Cersei seemed ready to say something for a brief moment, but she said nothing, and for the tiniest second, Joy thought that it was not because of any sense of love for her husband or any realization as to how the king felt, but because her own father was stood beside her, and there were few men in the world who knew and understood the king's pain in that moment than the Lord of Casterly Rock, a man who had also lost the woman he loved more than anything else so many years before. She could respect and admire the king for doing what he did, then, even if it was perhaps not entirely proper or courtly to do such a thing so soon after arriving and after so long a journey. But with the departure of the king and the Lord of Winterfell to whatever tomb was that of Lady Lyanna Stark, the formality that had dominated the courtyard began to melt away as some semblance of normalcy began to descend upon the courtyard, slowly at first with the servants coming to take the belongings of their guests to their bedchambers, and then more quickly as the royal retinue beginning to meet with their northern hosts for the first time, some heading into the city to see what this strange mirror of southern life might offer. Come along, niece, her uncle said at last as Myrcella and Tommen went towards the younger Starks to speak with them, leaving the Stark bastard alone for the time being. It is time for you to meet the man who shall be your groom. Of course, uncle, she answered with a slight bow, and followed, walking alongside the Lord of Casterly Rock towards the snow, who looked around, seemingly trying to find something to do, Direwolf at his heels. Then he saw the two of them walking towards him, and realized. Greetings, my lord, he said with the same practiced voice as his true-born siblings, if perhaps not quite as perfect, the snow seeming to shrink back a little as the tall and stoic Tywin Lannister stood before him, his shadow falling across the bastard's face. I am Jon Snow, Lord Stark's bastard son. Is there something I may help you with? I would like to introduce you to my niece, Joy Hill, the Lord of Casterly Rock answered, Jon's attentions going to Joy almost instantly, the meaning of his words plain. She is the bastard daughter of my brother Geryon, and is almost of an age to wed. A pleasure to meet you, Snow, she said with all the warmth she could muster. I have heard much about you in Casterly Rock, though less about your home. News from the north takes time to reach the south, Jon answered, with Joy feeling that he was at a loss as to what else to say, seemingly taken completely by surprise by her presence. Most Southrons know little about us but what the singers and stories say. And just so, she pounced on the opening, just as her uncle would have wanted her to. The city looks a wondrous place, but not one a lady should go without an escort. Would you be so kind as to give me a tour, so that I might be able to find my way around for the rest of our stay here? Of course, my lady, if the Lord Lannister wouldn't mind us doing so, Jon replied. I have matters to attend to with your lord, Father Tywin answered with a voice as firm as his words were deft, playing his part well. I see no harm in it. Then Jon offered his arm, and Joy took it with an amount of reservedness that was entirely proper, smiling as the love-struck maids in the songs and stories were supposed to do, even if her blush was more from the cold than not. Shall we go, then? Where do you wish to go first? Jon asked. Shall we go to the market? She asked with a smile as the two started to walk together, leaving her uncle behind. She was on her own, now, and every word she said and every move she made would have to be one that was the result of careful thinking if she was to do what her uncle wanted her to do, and so she thought. More news made its way to the south than the Starks seemed to know, if perhaps distorted by the act of it being passed from one person to the next, but it was enough for her to have some idea of what topics to speak of, what to say and what not to say, and for now, all she had to do was learn as much about him as possible, so that she might learn if a marriage between the two of them might be possible at all, if he planned to go to the wall or travel to Essos as a wandering sellsword or anything of the like. So, Jon, have you ever traveled outside the north before? Asterisk 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 asterisk. End of part 16. Notes. I told you we would be back. Laughing smiley. It's been a long time coming, a very long time for that matter, as I've needed to go round the story circulation wheel, but we are here again, at least until part 20, and to prevent such an absurdly long delay again, and I myself am fully willing to say that, because I've had an extremely busy year in real life and got a lot /u of important stuff done, I'm going to be scrapping my existing story rotation system, replacing it with a new one, instead of rotating every 5 or so parts, I will rotate after every single part, so if this was the start of the new system, the next part would be a Dragon of Harrenhal 1, then one for a Northern Dragoness, then one for a Broken Star or any of my other large projects before coming back here, with room for minor stories between each group of 2. This won't be coming into effect until sometime after the end of this batch of parts, so don't worry, you've still got my complete attention for quite a while longer. But what this means is that in the future you will never need to wait what must have been an entire year for another group of parts, only a week or 2 at the most, something that I am sure you will all be happy to know about. And now, on to the summary. In this part, the royal retinue arrives at Winterfell, after a rather lengthy trek across the 7 kingdoms by land up the King's Road, tongue-poking smiley. And we get to see Joy Hill, the girl who is expecting to be Jon's betrothed. As you can probably tell from her POV, she's rather different from most of the other female characters that we've seen in the story so far. Rather than being like Wild Arya, Strong Sansa, Quiet Lion or Wanton Adra, she is a bastard who has been treated, a bastard for the entirety of her life, never once getting for even a moment the sort of feeling that Jon might have of being almost trueborn in how people treat him. If Jon is a subversion of the traits of a bastard, then Joy is them played straight, closer to his canonical character than not. More than that, she was raised by none other than her uncle Tywin Lannister and so takes after him a great deal as a result, being made from some rather stern and strong stuff, but she is also entirely committed to the expectations that the West AOC nobility might have of her, and so acts accordingly. As a bastard girl, someone who doesn't truly belong to either the nobility or the small folk, she is a bit of a lonesome character, but one who is entirely able to relax around some people, such as the uncle who raised her and to whom she shows deference in all things. I had thought about expanding the part above to include a little bit more, showing a scene with them in the marketplace getting to know one another a bit more, but I had a bit of trouble actually implementing said scene in that, due to its nature as one character asking questions and the other answering them, it tended to come out rather dry and repeat a lot of the stuff that earlier parts covered, and I already basically had that same feeling already present in the part above. If people want to see that, however, just say, and I will put it together as an edit of the part above. And of course, we have the first time a Southron character sees Winterfell. Laughing smiley. Information about the North does regularly reach the South, but it is often twisted by the journey by the time it reaches the nobility, and the more disconnected you are from the system, the further you are from the north, the more what you hear is twisted by the journey, as is mentioned in the part above. The south knows that the north has cities, for example, and knows that they have castles and so on, but they have little idea what these cities might actually be like, since the word city is actually rather vague in a medieval setting due to the nature of a city simply being a town that has been given a charter and allowed to do so, and that could range from anything like fair market, if the River Kings decided to try and not stifle its growth to avoid being eclipsed by their own vassal, as is mentioned in Wyeth, to King's Landing or even to the scale of one of the free cities of Essos. All this means that views on the power of the North vary. There are some who think that it is stronger than it is here, some that think that it is weaker than it is here, and some that think it is basically as strong as it is in canon. The Lannisters in general are some of the most informed about the actual situation of the North, due to having extensive trade relations with them and having aided the construction of the canal, but Joy unfortunately doesn't have access to that kind of information, due to being a bastard with the status of being a bastard. And with that the summary is done, and I say Merry Christmas. Laughing smiley. Chapter 17, Eddard 3. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Beneath Winterfell. If there was ever a place in Winterfell that had not changed over 300 years of peace and prosperity, 300 years of growth and development, Eddard knew that it was the crypts beneath the castle. The passing of time had not changed them in the slightest, nor had the increased wealth of the Starks, and he could still remember being told the same when he had first passed through the ironwood door into the place beneath Winterfell at the side of his father, who had once told him the story of how his own father had once taken him below the surface to visit the crypts just as he had done with Eddard and his brothers and his sister, telling the four of them how ancient and old they were, and the crypts had changed little since then, gaining not even dust in the 30 years that had passed since that day he walked besides a father and a brother and a sister that had long since gone below never to come out again. Everywhere he looked, everywhere the lords of Winterfell who had come before him had looked, the stones were the same blocks of deep grey granite, and the mortar that held them together was the same, as were the statues and swords of grey iron that were laid across their laps to keep their spirits at bay, sheathed blades that told them that their duty to house and kin was over and done and that they might now be able to rest. There was even the same silence as there had been then, the ceiling of the crypts made from slabs of masonry so thick as to be able to muffle out the sounds of the city above, and even Robert had an unusual grim demeanor about him so far from the sun's light, an expression that Eddard had never seen him wear before, not even in the cold and quiet emptiness of the Eyrie so far away from all the normal warmth and noise of a normal castle like Winterfell or Storm's End. In such a quiet place, the only sound he could hear was that of their footsteps against the hard stones beneath their boots, echoing off the walls and down the steps into the lower levels of the crypt, where the oldest lords of Winterfell and the kings in the north who came before them were buried, and where a cold breeze rose from deep beneath the earth to make the light of his torch flicker and the cloak of Stark and Baratheon alike flutter. Even Eddard had never been to the bottom of the crypts. He had tried to once, on one of Brandon's days, but the cold had grown more and more intense with every floor of the descent and the flame weaker and the shadows closer, till by the 7th floor it felt as cold as winter time and their torch had become as bright as a weak candle, the darkness all around like claws and the freezing air blowing past them like the breaths of some great frozen beast, and so they had turned back, no further down than the tomb of King Brandon Shadowslayer, who slew the last Shadowcat in the north with his bare hands after it had attacked him whilst he was out hunting in the Wolf's Wood, forcing his entire arm up to the shoulder inside its mouth the moment it opened its jaws to bite, unable to close them again on so large a thing, all whilst it was being pummeled with his free hand before it finally choked and died. He had walked around with its skull on his shoulder in times of both peace and war after that, or so the legends said and as the statue had shown. They had tried to go deeper than that on a few times, but had trouble even making it that far ever again, the cold killing their torches and making its way through thick furs with far too much ease for them to get so far, and Brandon had eventually lost interest in going into the lower levels of the crypts in favor of going into the lower levels of whichever girl had taken his fancy at whichever brothel had managed to draw his attentions and hold them for however long. Times were different, then, and he set such thoughts aside when he saw the stones on the floor grow familiar as they reached the newest group of tombs in Winterfell's crypts, Eddard recognizing all the statues around him instantly. His confident brother Brandon, standing tall with a teasing smile on his stone face and with his elbows resting upon the crossguard of the sword that was embedded into the stone at his side, another made from iron inside a sheath of stone at his hip, a stone wolf sat alongside, every statue having a dire wolf even if they had not had them in life. Opposite him was their father, Lord Rickard Stark, sat in a granite throne with eyes as firm and strong as those of any king, and with a dire wolf sat besides, alert and ready to hear his master's commands, but more than anything else hair and the bare blade of an iron sword across his lap, as if denying guest right to the spirits of the old kings who ruled the lower levels of the crypt, or as if to deny the living comfort in this dark place, until it was their time to join their kin below. And just past him was the newest statue of all. Lyanna. She had not aged a day since he had last saw her, none of them had, no matter how much he might have wished otherwise, and whereas in life she had always been ever moving and ever busy with something or another, ever talking to a friend or to the small folk who surrounded their home, it was there that the masons had made their one error. They had given her the right face and the right body, but the wrong life, the sculpture standing atop her pedestal with a sombre and silent stillness that was not at all how she had once been. He had always meant to have the statue taken down, to have it replaced with one that was more accurate to her nature, but that somber-faced girl who stood before him was exactly how he last remembered her, exactly how she had been when she realized what was happening and when the warmth had left her body, and that made the sight of her resting place sting all the more. She looks how I remember, Robert said grimly as the two men came to a stop in front of her, the king looking up towards the statue with sad eyes and a sad face so utterly unlike his normal, boastful self. I remember those eyes, that tousled hair. I remember her at Harrenhal, laughing when I drove those boys away from Howland Reed. We all do, Your Grace, Eddard answered quietly. Did you have to put her down here in this darkness? Robert asked, not once taking his eyes from hers. She should be in the sun in that city of yours, surrounded by winter roses. She loved winter roses. It was her wish to come home, came the reply of the Lord of Winterfell. This is her place. Her place was with me, Robert said, his voice little higher than a whisper, and for the briefest moment Eddard thought he saw a tear glisten in the orange light of his torch on the king's cheek. I never wanted that damned throne, Ned. I fought for her. Every blow of my hammer was to bring her back again. I got what I never wanted, and lost what I did. The king sighed then, and reached into a long leather pouch affixed to the side of his still armored waist, a place where most knights might keep their coin or a small carving of the warrior to take into battle with them, or anything else that they considered too precious to leave behind in their camp, and though he could not see what the king put into his left hand, he saw what went into his right, a wooden box half the length of Eddard's forearm, and raised the lid with a flick of his armored finger, revealing that, inside, there was a silver bracelet dotted with sapphires, a band of prancing stags and running direwolves, alongside a single winter's rose, as bright a blue as the sky at noon. The king placed the band upon her wrist and the rose inside its box at her feet, then returned to his full height, seeming to stand taller than he had a moment before, as though a great burden had been lifted from his shoulders, and finally he turned to Eddard again, more at ease with himself than he had been in years, and the two started towards the surface once more. I didn't just come here to pay my respects to her, Ned, the king finally said as they began to move away from her resting place, getting to the topic that Eddard knew he would go to eventually. I came here for you. He reached out with his left hand, opened it, and revealed a clasp of a golden hand, one of many badges of office that belonged to the hand of the king. I want you to come south with me, Ned, Robert said. Jon Arryn was a father to the both of us, and my hand as well. He held the realm together for 14 years. Robert, Eddard said, cutting off his friend before he could sway him with his famous charisma. My place is here in Winterfell. The realm is vast, and winter is coming, Robert acknowledged, before replying. I'm not asking you to run the damned kingdom for me, Ned, not as Jon had whilst I wasted my life whoring and drinking my way towards an early grave. Eddard blinked. You've given up wine, he asked in stunned disbelief. What is happening, Robert, for you to give up wine and women? Not even Jon could make you do that. Then without hesitation or thought the king raised his left hand, looking at his own reflection in the steel, and then he reached into his thick black hair and plucked out a single strand, showing it towards his closest friend as though it were a blooded dagger. What should have been a black as dark as charcoal was as grey as iron. I'm aging, Ned, Robert said quietly. Jon's death made me realize it. I'm not so young as I once was, Ned, and I will be damned if people think of me as a drunkard king as often in my cups as Aes was in his madness when I am gone. No one would ever call you that, Robert Eddard said honestly. You are nothing like him. But I want the singers to say that mine was a good reign, Ned. I won't have them comparing me to him or to Rhaegar or to any other damned Targaryen for that matter and saying that I was a Pispa ruler, Robert said. I want to take the realm and make it great, and I want you at my side to do it with, Wolf and Stag, Stark and Baratheon, together again. As it should have been from the start. What about your brother, Stannis? Why not make him hand? He fled to Dragonstone not long before Jon Arryn died, Robert said. Besides, he would be a worse hand than that fool my niece is fond of. Jon Arryn was clever enough to know that the loyalists needed to be forgiven to heal the realm, whilst my brother would have had us marching on Highgarden. What of Tywin Lannister? Eddard reasoned. He is a fair if harsh man, and made a good hand for Aes. Because if there are any more Lannisters in the Red Keep they might as well take my banners down and put theirs up, the king laughed. Now come on, Ned. Take the damned title and come south with me. Robb will learn how to run the land on his own without you behind his shoulder, and I'll give that bastard of yours a place at court too if he wants one, mayhaps a place in the King's Guard once Sir Barristan passes. I have other plans for Jon, Eddard said honestly. I mean to give him a castle of his own and lands as well, so that he might found another cadet branch of the family. The king looked at him then, thinking. And then Robert smiled. Tell you what, Ned, Robert said. Serve as my hand for 5 years of summer. Should the Maesters say winter is coming, then you can go back to Winterfell and wait it out with your family and come back to the Red Keep when spring arrives again. When those 5 years are done, you can go back to Winterfell or stay with me as my hand, without complaint or question. Do this, and I will legitimize him and give him and his lands my blessing. It will give him and his house a strong start, and there is not a lord in the realm who would consider a man that the king has given his own support to as a poor groom. Eddard was more than tempted at such an offer, and it was because what the king said was right. The support and recognition of the crown would give Jon and his line an incredibly strong start in that the nobility of the realm would be more willing to accept his rise, more willing to respect him as something separate from the Starks of Winterfell and as the head of his own house. Such a boon would last for generations, making it all the easier for Jon and his own sons and grandsons and great-grandsons to find brides of their own and for their sisters to find worthy husbands without needing to pay so great a dowry as to beggar their line, and that ability to stand on his own was more important than anything, for whilst Eddard was willing to support Jon in establishing himself as lord and was sure that Robb was willing to do the same, would Robb's sons and grandsons feel the same way? Would they have the same bond that their forefathers had and look after their cousins when they needed help? Or would they cut them loose and allow them to thrive or fail by their own merits? Such a thing had happened before, on more than one occasion, and there were 5 times as many failed branches of the Stark line as there were successful ones, the town Starks who had lived in the city rather than the castle, just as the Lannisters of Lannisport did, only to instead die out after losing all their wealth in a mere 4 generations after their founding by living beyond their incomes and be subsumed into the regular population when the main line was unwilling to drag them out of their mess, and there had been others before them, the Rock Starks of the northern mountains who failed to find a strong income of their own, the North Starks who had dared to settle beyond the wall only to disappear without a trace, and so many others. Indeed, Eddard was sure there had even been an extremely short-lived branch of Steppe Starks who came from one bastard's ideas to try and conquer part of the Stepstones with the support of the North, only to die in the first battle by slipping on the deck in a harsh wave and being carried overboard and into a watery grave by the weight of his armor. But that was only a family legend, as far as he knew. I will think about it, Your Grace, he said, his words truthful. Instantly, Robert clapped him on the shoulder with a warm smile. Now that's the Ned I remember. It'll be good to have you in the south, it'll be just like old times again, and more fun, too. Say what you will about that pile of swords the Targaryens called a throne, it is lonely at the top. Your Grace. In the rebellion I could ask people for advice if I wasn't sure how to proceed, and men would call it wise to take the advice of others rather than risk everything in uncertainty, Robert explained. The moment the High Septon put that crown on my head people started to see it as weakness, as if I had no damned idea what I was doing, as if I was ruled by my council and not the other way around. They won't say that when you are there, though, Robert finished. Everyone in the realm knows you and I are as brothers. They won't question it. There was quiet, for a moment. Then Robert asked a question of his own, wanting the first counsel from the man he hoped would become his hand. What say you of conquering the lands beyond the wall? Robert asked eagerly. Take 1,000 swords from every realm, second sons who have no lands of their own, and we could make the realm into 8 kingdoms instead of just 7, or 9 kingdoms if we take Andalos too. Mayhaps even 10 kingdoms if we claim the stepstones. Do the lies not lay claim to those lands, your grace? They do, the king smiled. But if we build more war galleys, then they wouldn't want to risk a fight and would be smashed even if they did. The king looked on, then, smiling widely as he imagined the glories that were to come, before bringing his attentions to the present once more as they came towards the staircase that connected the highest level of the crypt to the surface world, where the cold air of the outside world was blocked from entering by a thick door of iron wood. Where do you plan to land that bastard of yours anyway? Robert asked as the pair began their ascent up the steep steps. There can't be much land in the north still unclaimed for him to have, is there? Even the north isn't so big that every second son can have a city of his own. There is a town north of Darkport, on the river of the Rills, named Riverton. Eddard started. The family that ruled it were large till the great spring sickness reduced them down to a handful, and the last lost his heirs in Greyjoy's revolt before passing himself a year ago. It's a small town, no more than a few thousand, and it will make him a vassal to the Risswells, but they are good and honest men and the small folk make their living mining leisurely to make blue dye. Eddard reasoned. There are other places as well. If you give him that town, tell me, Robert answered. I'll make sure to wear blue at the next feast. It'll make half the realm change clothes. Eddard laughed. This was the Robert he remembered, the Robert from before the rebellion and before he had lost his betrothed, the invincible warrior who could make friends with any and all, highborn or low, and who could turn enemy into ally with just a few minutes of conversation and a few cups of wine. If he wanted to make the realm strong, to be remembered as a good king, then there was no doubt about it, as Robert certainly had the ability to do so. With the respect that the realm gave him for his strength and skill at arms and his famous charisma, there was little that he could not do to heal the bonds that held the realm together and mend the damage that years of mismanagement and abuse had done to the crown in the eyes of its vassals, and that made Eddard wonder. If Robert was certainly so capable of doing it, then why hadn't he done it before now? He was at the age when a man began to start thinking about the legacy he would leave behind. That was true, but that raised the question of what had Robert been doing all those years before finding the motivation to truly make use his power, and what Eddard might find in King's Landing if he did indeed take up the office as the king's hand. Then they came upon the ironwood door that sealed the crypts tightly, and he put such thoughts aside to reflect upon later when he had the chance, instead turning his attentions to the present. As they opened the door and passed through, into a small and inconspicuous garden in the rear of the small cemetery that surrounds the first keep, the burial place for the Starks' most favored of servants, the cold air struck their cheeks once more, and it felt warm in comparison to the bitter cold of the earth below, and from there they saw that the courtyard had cleared out for the most part, the knights and ladies of Robert's retinue having gone to their chambers or to the city or to any other place in the castle, their things being swiftly brought out of the courtyard whilst the massive wheelhouse that was the Queen's residence whilst travelling was moved towards the stables where its horses had been fed and watered. Sir Barristan Selmy stood as still and as silent as any one of the statues of the crypt beneath his feet, made himself known with dutiful movements towards the king's side, taking his place alongside his charge once again, and Robert clapped Eddard on the shoulder once more. I best find that wife of mine before she starts thinking about coronations. The king laughed. I tell you, if I went on a hunt that took a minute longer than I said it would, she would say I died and slap a crown on Joffrey's head. Then I will see you at the feast, your grace. Eddard bowed. We have much to catch up on, and good wine and good food to do it over, the king said warmly. I look forward to it, Eddard said, smiling at last. And with that, the armored king departed towards the wing of the keep that proudly flew Baratheon banners in representation of it being given over towards the use of the crown, and stumbled into Robb's tutor, the silver-haired and violet-eyed Horono Veneris, the Volunten in what was surely the formal dress of his homeland, a great tiger pelt of orange and black around his shoulders and wrapped across his chest like an immense cloak. Eddard sighed. The king had never once had an issue with those of Valyrian descent before the rebellion, and most certainly not with Valyrian women, that Eddard knew full well, but afterwards, He could not be sure if that trend had changed, not with the Targaryens and their immense pride in their amethyst eyes and silver locks, and if the king took offense. "And who are you?" the king asked. "I hadn't expected to see a Valyrian so far north." "I am Horono Veneris, your grace," the Volanten answered deftly. "A free citizen of Volantis. Your deeds in vanquishing the Targaryens are legend there." "Truly?" the king asked with some surprise. "I thought the free cities would have some fondness for the Targaryens, especially a Volanten." "Not Volantis," Veneris answered. "Why would we, when Aegon the Conqueror slaughtered our armies and burnt our fleets? No, the greatest Targaryens are dead Targaryens." The king roared with laughter then, and grinned before the two continued on their respective paths without further incident, leaving Eddard to believe that what had seen and heard was perhaps the best possible way for their meeting to have ended, before continuing on his own way, towards the great hall where he knew his lady wife was already at work making preparations for the feast to come, as was a woman's work. Winterfell was the seat of one of the most important families in Westeros, even if the rest of the realm did not realize the exact state of the north, which meant that it was to be expected that a feast be held whenever a visitor of importance arrived to stay within his halls, and of all the figures in Westeros, of all the people that could stay there were none of greater importance than that of the king and his kin. That meant his lady wife had the task of planning and preparing a feast that would have to be truly grand in scale, lest people think that the Starks did not give their sovereign lord their full hospitality and began thinking of dark thoughts and questionable loyalties. But Winterfell was so great a castle and with so large a household and so many guests of high station that planning even a minor feast was a difficulty, though one Catelyn faced without complaint and with the knowledge that all of Winterfell's resources were at her disposal, though she had been rather quiet as of late, and he had little idea exactly what it was that she had planned. And when he stepped through the door into the great hall that should have been his own, it felt as if he had walked into a different castle. On the left and right walls were 3 massive banners of black stags and golden lions, huge things that would not shame the greatest of warships to have flown from their masts, and between the walls were 8 rows of tables separated by an aisle long enough for 4 men to walk abreast without touching. The guests sat on either side, and beneath the galleries that were already packed with quietly planning musicians were 3 huge barrels on their sides, great big pipes of oak wood that each held 128 gallons of wine or ale that the servants were already hard at work preparing for the evening, tapping the wooden spigots in with hefty mallets, and just below the dais was another smaller barrel, a hogshead of 64 gallons, placed on its side with a small glass window placed in the lid to reveal the dark mold within, beneath which was a set of hooks that held a bronze spigot shaped like a stag's head and the ruined mallet with which to drive it in. In the old days of the kings in the north and when the first men dominated the realm, it had not been uncommon for the vassals of the realm to pay their taxes to their overlords in long-lasting malt, in recognition of its great value to man and woman both. Malt could last indefinitely in a cold cellar without losing its flavor, but it was also nourishing and could provide the energy one needed to survive the cold days and colder nights of wintertime, but weak enough that a mother could bring her babe from breast to cup without the risk of poisoning them, all of which had made it perfect for life in the north, and that perfection had made it valued, and that value had made it a tradition for an honored guest to be allowed to make the strike that would tap the barrel and to take the first cup. Eddard knew that Robert would love that tradition in particular, even if he said he had gone off of wine, and as he walked forward he saw something else different from the norm. Tiny wooden banners atop long poles rising from besides the plates of every seat, each carrying the sigil of the one that was meant to be seated there. Plates and bowls and cups of trifle pewter were already being placed alongside, and the latest Essozi trend of using miniature pitchforks with which to hold part of their meal in place so that the knife might cut and stab more easily had reached the city through White Harbor, and every plate had one alongside a good sharp blade and a spoon. But when he looked forward again, to the dais, he saw his lady wife and his 2 daughters making the final preparations for the feast, Catelyn commanding the servants with a practiced voice, Sansa sat in her chair grimly doing what it was that she was told and Arya taking the initiative and instructing the servants in how to proceed without her mother's input and seemingly enjoying the act of doing so, a rare reversal of things if there ever was one. He ascended the steps, and his wife gave him the maximum amount of attention and warmth that was proper, as it was not seemly for a lord and his lady wife to show one another anything more than a mild fondness in front of others, even if they loved one another, and Arya smiled with excitement at the one part of being a lady that she seemed to enjoy, and Sansa didn't even seem to acknowledge his presence in the slightest, or the presence of anything at all for that matter, not since Robert had made clear his hope to see their families joined, and as much as Eddard might have wanted to reassure her and tell her that she would not have to marry Joffrey instead of Domeric unless she so wanted to, he could not so quickly after the offer had been made anyhow, as it had to seem the result of careful deliberation for it to be proper to decline so generous an offer. "How go the preparations, my lady wife?" Eddard asked, with all the dutiful courtesy that might be expected of a great lord. "King Robert expects a great feast. And it is a great feast that he shall have," Catelyn said with the hint of a smile. "The preparations go well, my lord husband." The cooks had some trouble for a time with their ovens, but they sorted the matter quick enough. "There should be no more issues from now on, if the gods are kind. And I hope our daughters have learned something." "I'm helping," Arya said eagerly and with a surprising amount of pride. "I helped find mummers for the feast. They are going to do a show about Robert's rebellion, and one of them has a huge costume with 3 dragon heads that breathes fire. His Grace will enjoy that." Eddard smiled, his wife looking towards their younger daughter with approval as he looked towards Sansa. "And what of my eldest daughter? What have you been doing, Sansa?" "Please don't make me marry Joffrey," she said quietly without taking her eyes up from the ground. "Sansa," Catelyn said quickly, ready to say more before Eddard silenced her with a glance before sitting alongside his daughter upon the table's edge. "I will talk with Robert about it when I get the chance," he said softly and quietly. "But what if he tries to make me do it?" Sansa asked, looking towards him with fearful eyes. "What if?" "It's all right," he said, stopping her before she could work herself into a nightmare. "He won't press the matter, not if I wish otherwise and not if you aren't willing. Robert would never force a woman to marry someone they would not want to, and there are other women for the prince to marry. Robert's wish to see their family joined made sense, and more than the king himself might have realized. In the 7 kingdoms, there were 3 great families in the Lannisters, the Tyrells and the Starks, and all 3 combined could defeat the rest of the realm, and as the rebellion showed, a king could only be king if he had the guaranteed support of 2 of them. Through his marriage to Cersei Lannister and the blood that flowed through his children's veins, Robert had access to unending wealth and a powerful ally in the Lord of Casterly Rock, but the change of dynasties that the war had brought with its conclusion had broken the peace of the realm and meant that the transition from Targaryen to Baratheon would need extra support in order to avoid the remaining loyalists rising in revolt, if perhaps for only a few generations till people became accustomed to having a stag as their king instead of a dragon. But that meant for his son's reign to be truly secure from threats within and without, he would need another ally, and with the Tyrells well remembered for their acts of besieging Storm's End and in driving Robert from the field at Ashford, it was clear why he might pass over the Reach in favor of the North, especially with the close bond that the 2 men had forged with their time together at the Eyrie and on the battlefield. But with the power of the Hand of the King at his disposal, Eddard could easily try to arrange a match between Joffrey and the Tyrell maiden, Margaery, in order to ensure that his friend gets the alliance he needs without having to surrender his daughter to someone she does not love, and that was all the more reason to consider the king's offer more seriously. To protect his family and make sure that they had the chance to live the lives they wanted to live, Eddard would do anything, and a mere 5 years in the south was a little price to pay if it meant that Jon might be able to found a strong dynasty and Sansa marry the one she loves. Sansa looked at him more hopefully, and he gave her a small smile before rising to his feet once more and looking towards his lady wife, their eldest daughter, more at ease than before. "Will your uncle be sat with us upon the dais?" he asked, curious. "I would hope so," Catelyn answered, her voice carrying the hint of weariness. "I had sent a raven to invite him here so that we might talk, but he seems more interested in talking with Robb and Brandon than me. He has his reasons. I am sure he will be happy to speak with you again during the feast," Eddard answered with his lordly voice. "Robert and I will spend most of the feast discussing a matter." "Oh. What matter?" Eddard raised his left hand to his right shoulder, as if adjusting the clasp of his cloak to be more loose in the indoor warmth of Winterfell's great hall. He saw the realization in her eyes instantly, a mix of surprise and unease. "It is a small matter," Eddard said, before changing the topic in case one was listening in and thought to tell the King or Tywin Lannister that he did not know whether or not to accept the office. "What other entertainment shall we have for the evening?" "Tumblers and aerialists were easy enough to find," Catelyn answered, glancing towards the aisle that split the hall down the middle, disapproving. "They say there is enough space to perform, but should something go wrong they will land on someone." But the musicians know all the king's favorite songs. 54 tons and a cask of ale. Indeed, and the reins of Castle Maria too, she added. Lord Lannister should like it. Eddard nodded, and silently hoped that it might get him to explain a question that had been on Eddard's mind ever since the Raven had come the month before. Why would Tywin Lannister come north so quickly after Jon Arryn died, and without sending a message at that, unless the Lord of Casterly Rock himself was afraid of something? And if Tywin Lannister was concerned of something, it had to be something of dire importance. Asterisk 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 asterisk. End of part 17. Notes. Well, this was a fun one to write, though I am tired out from wrapping it up, so there won't be much of a summary. Tongue-poking smiley. But in short, and in a very summarized nature, in this part we see Robert offering the handship for many of the same reasons as in canon. With Jon Arryn dead and the Lannisters filling the royal court to the brim, he wants a close and trusted friend there alongside him in the south to help him run the realm. But Eddard was less receptive, and so Robert has come up with a deal: serve as his hand for 5 years of summertime and choose whether to stay on in the role or leave at the end of it, buying time for the king to have a chance to forge a legacy worth having, a rather different goal for him than giving him the title so that King Bob could go down to the brothel and wine cellar every day. Oh, and before anyone says anything, Big Bobby Baratheon hasn't entirely given up on whoring and drinking, since that's about as likely as Aerion Bright Flame drinking wildfire and actually turning into a dragon, or the Iron Throne suddenly declaring itself king of the realm. Tongue-poking smiley. Anyway, from that point on, this POV primarily set the stage for a future POV, that of Catelyn in the next part, from whom we shall see the lords and wards of Winterfell feast in King Robert's name and all the entertaining fun that will be, followed by a Robb POV which, I assure you, will be a fun part indeed, and then a mystery part, because who doesn't love surprises? Laughing smiley. Chapter 18, Catelyn 3. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Asterisk 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 asterisk. A few hours later. The great hall of Winterfell was quiet but for the sound of torches and braziers and hearths all crackling, and Catelyn stood in the perfect silence next to her husband in her finest clothes, a long dress of the soft reds and blues that were the colors of her family, and besides her were all the high-born women of Winterfell in a long line that stretched from the place beneath the dais where the 64-gallon hogshead of ale and all its decoration was kept to the open door, and opposite her was Robb and then Brandon and then Rickon and then all the other men of Winterfell and even the bastard who had the place at the far end, all of them but for her husband, all in a row that mirrored her own. Only Eddard Stark himself was separate from this row, stood before the barrel in his own finery, as was the ancient tradition of the first men when one's liege lord came to feast in the hall of his vassal, something that she had witnessed many times before from the other perspective whenever her husband and her family were invited to a feast with one of their vassals, with it being her husband's vassals and family who were lined through the hall and her husband leading their family inside. But here it was again, with the roles reversed, with the Lord of Winterfell waiting as the King of the Seven Kingdoms walked towards him, in clothes of perfect black and brilliant gold, followed by his wife Cersei and then their 3 golden-haired children, with Joffrey first as the heir to the realm and then Tommen and Myrcella, each with a line of their own, from the most powerful and prestigious men at the front to the lowliest retainer in the rear. From the balconies above, it would have looked almost like a sword entering a sheath, with the king as the very tip of the blade, but her familiarity with the proceeding and the king's warm and friendly nature, shown even in the silence in the form of a curious but eager smile, made it feel like nothing of the sort, and she was grateful that her husband had seen fit to make sure that the king knew well how he was meant to enter the hall beforehand, so that he would not embarrass himself and his families by not knowing how the Northmen did things when welcoming a guest to their hall on the first day of their stay. Just as how he had told him to expect gifts on the day of their departure, another tradition that had, in old times, served as a show that the host wanted his guest to return to his own home in a safe and expedient manner, something that was ever a concern in the cold blizzards of the north or in the then untamed forests of the south where all manner of long-forgotten beasts had once lurked and feasted on the bones of men, but now, it was just something for one to remember their visit with and little more. Your Grace, her husband started, dropping to one knee before the king. The honor is yours. Then with open hands he raised the mallet, its wooden surface covered in deeply carved runes made red with the sap of a wood tree. The king took it with one hand, and Eddard took the bronze spigot and moved it into over the small ring of softer wood, holding it carefully so that his hands would not be hit when Robert made the first strike. Watch your hands, Robert said with a smile, placing the mallet's flat side directly against the antlered head of the spigot. I'm going to put it through with one hit. Your Grace, Eddard said quietly. If you strike too hard, it might crack. If there's anything I'm good with, Ned, it's a hammer, and a mallet's just another kind of hammer. Robert smiled, bringing the hammer back for strength. And before her husband could say another word, there was the bang of the strike and of spigot-piercing barrel. A finely dressed servant appeared, giving the king a silver cup covered in prancing stags and running wolves, a piece of well-made metalwork from White Harbor that had been in Winterfell's cupboards for as long as she could remember, being there even on the first day that she had arrived at Winterfell with a newborn Robb in her arms. Not that she had ever had a good answer for it existing in the first place, even her husband knew little about its history other than that his lord father had ordered a crate's worth years before, along with plates and serving trays and everything else that might be needed on the feast table. The king's eyes went wide at the sight, and he grinned widely before placing it beneath the bronze stag's mouth and pushing on the antlers to bring a dark and frothy ale flowing forth. Then he raised it, taking a small sip. And he smiled. You Northmen make damned good ale, Ned, the king laughed. And then, instantly, the music began to play, Robert clapping Eddard on the shoulder for the second time since their arrival as the two of them climbed up the steps onto the dais, smiling and talking between themselves the way close brothers might with every step, Catelyn and Cersei following behind and then their children behind them and then those few who were given the privilege of sitting in a position of honor upon the dais, a short list, but one that included men as important as Lord Tywin Lannister and Theon Greyjoy, the heir to the Iron Islands and one whom the king was curious about, and more importantly than any other, to her, was her uncle. But before she could seek him out, before she could even sit at her table, she saw Tywin Lannister give his daughter Cersei a silent glance, and moments after the Lannister woman turned towards Catelyn with a smile, though the Tully woman was clever enough to know that it was only diplomatic, and only because it was expected for two ladies of such high station to interact with one another. It seems our husbands have much to catch up on, Lady Stark, Cersei said, with all the softness that would be expected of a queen. It has been a long time since they have last met, hasn't it? Indeed it has, Your Grace, Catelyn said, returning the courtesies. They have not seen one another since the end of the Greyjoy rebellion. They will have much to talk about. As will you and I, Cersei said, smiling as the two came to their seats and sat, the queen besides her husband and Catelyn besides an empty seat intended for her uncle, and though Robert and Eddard were happily talking with one another out of friendship, catching up on the better part of a decade of separation, so much so that Catelyn wondered if her beloved husband had forgotten what it was that Robert had offered him and what he hoped for of Sansa and his own son, whilst Catelyn and Cersei did the same simply because it was expected of them to do so, if Tehi were not already talking to someone else. We have neither seen nor spoken since the royal wedding at King's Landing. How have you been? Well, Your Grace, and you? Catelyn returned, with as much diplomacy and as little joy as her queen. Well, Cersei answered as if the two were friends. It hasn't been too cold for you here, so far from Riverrun. In truth, the two knew little about one another. Catelyn herself had been preoccupied with the young Robb at the time, and Cersei herself had been with her brother and making preparations for the wedding whenever she was available, meaning the two had said few words to one another the entire day, and at Harrenhal before then both had been expected to ignore the other's presence in the ladies' game to see whose beauty received the most favor from the crowds and lords assembled, a game which Rhaegar seemingly won, seeing how much attention he received from man and woman alike there, not that he had ever enjoyed any of it. At first it had been so cold at night that I could never get warm, no matter how many blankets I put on, Catelyn answered honestly, making an attempt to break through the awkward disconnect between her and her queen. I became used to it after a while, though, and Winterfell is warmer in winter than Riverrun ever is. How come? There are pipes in the walls, Your Grace, Catelyn said as the first plates were put before the two ladies, both with 3 thick cuts of ham that had been drizzled in honey and served with grapes of a deep green and a good bun of soft bread, garnished with a single slice of lemon, a rare thing in the north. They carry hot water from the springs beneath Winterfell to every part of the castle, and there is a place where the servants could start a fire to help heat it, no matter how cold it might be in winter. A clever design, came the voice of Tywin Lannister from further down the table, sat besides her husband, his tone carrying the hint of curiosity with it. What material are the pipes made from? Lead. Copper, my lord, she answered. The Smithies have had little use of it since the Andals crossed the narrow sea and brought iron and steel with them, but the North still has many mines full of it and little to do with it. But since it is easy to work with and the metal so common, every part of Winterfell has it. Even some of the small folk can afford to do it for their own homes, but they need to burn wood to heat the water and most simply use hay bales instead. Hay? Cersei asked. What good is hay in keeping one warm? The Northmen have found out that thick bales of it inside the walls help to trap the heat inside, Catelyn explained. I suppose it keeps it from escaping through the gaps between the stonework. I suppose that must be why your houses are all so large, the Queen answered. More because of how most families bring their kin from outside the city into their homes when winter comes. It lets them put their coin together to buy enough food, drink and firewood to make sure that they can all live through the cold when the snow comes. Pardon my lateness, my lords and ladies, said a voice that she looked towards to see. Someone she barely recognized after so many years away from Riverrun and away from the rest of her family. Her uncle Bryndon's thick red hair had long since turned to grey but for a few rare strands that were like the color of rust on iron, and his face had aged too, wrinkles on his brow that had never been there when she had left Riverrun and gone north with her husband at the end of the rebellion and after King Robert's coronation and wedding. But he had the same smile and the same eyes, the same movements, and finally he took his seat beside his niece. It seems people know of my part in the War of the Ninepenny Kings even here. Uncle Bryndon, Catelyn said with a smile, the Queen content to let her talk to someone else for a change and allowing her to do so without the haughty barrier of courtesies that were never needed around family. I was beginning to wonder if you would ever come to the feast. I was wondering if I would ever make it to the feast, her uncle laughed. Say what you will about Riverrun being small, but I would be damned if one couldn't find their way around it when they came to visit. A man could starve to death in this keep of your husband's before he ever found his way out. It gets easier the longer you are here, she said as Bryndon started cutting through his meat. It is good to see you again, uncle. And good to see you again, niece, Bryndon said warmly. It's been too long, Cat. Lysa sends her regards, though nowadays I'm not sure whether that is a good thing or a bad thing. What do you mean? Catelyn asked in confusion, narrowing her brow. Is something wrong with her? Your sister was always. Bryndon started quietly before trailing off, searching for the word. Emotional. You remember how she was, all shy and moody. The marriage to Jon Arryn didn't help much, but it's best not to talk about that here at the table. But your message found me at the Eyrie, and I came as quickly as I could, her uncle said, meeting her with his bright eyes. If you sent a message to me, it had to be important. And it is, Catelyn admitted, quieting her voice as the musicians ended their first song and went on to the next, 54 Tons, the king's favorite song from what her husband had told her. But it is also something not to be talked about here. Is it that bad? Her uncle asked grimly. More of a personal matter than anything bad, she said, the relief appearing on Bryndon's face almost instantly. But it is important, it is to do with my children. And at that, Bryndon laughed, nearly choking on a piece of ham before putting his hand on his brow and looking down at his plate. Gods! Cat, I thought you were hiding a meaning behind those words of yours on that letter, the amused Blackfish answered, reaching for a cup of wine to wash down his meat. If I had known that what you had written was what you actually meant, I might have taken my chance to enjoy the journey. But uncle, she objected quietly and under a cloak of grace. None of them want to be the way they should be. Robb would rather have all the women of Winterfell in his bed than be married. And Robb is barely 5 and 10, Bryndon answered. If a boy doesn't want half the world in his bed by that age, then there's something wrong with him. Look at him down there, Cat, Bryndon added with a point of his knife down the hall, to where Robb was sat with his half-brother, using the presence of Lord Tywin Lannister and the need for him to be on the dais as an excuse to be with Jon and the rest of his wolves, coincidentally perched with Wyler on his left and Aelys Karstark on his right. The boy's expected to make one of the most important choices in his life when he barely knows what that choice means, so there's no wonder why he wants to look around and see what he can find before he does, Bryndon said with a shrug, reaching for the lemon slice and squeezing the juice out onto the meat, humming to the tune of the music. But he does know, Catelyn said. He knows what a marriage means for him and his family, what an alliance will bring, what having children will mean. But does he know what it means for him? Bryndon countered instantly. Have you spoken to him about what that means? About What? About how if he chooses wrongly and ends up wedded to a woman he thought he loves but doesn't, he'll still be expected to make children with her. Brynden started. You can't push him along on this one, Kat, or do much more than guide him. He'll know when he's found someone he wants. And what if he doesn't? Caitlin asked. What if he never finds someone he loves? Then let him find someone that he can at least be friends with, Brynden reasoned. Most marriages in the realm are like that. She looked at him, then, with the sad eyes of a mother concerned for the well-being of her children and the futures that she hoped and dreamed to see them have. Robb as the proud heir of Winterfell with sons and daughters of his own and a wife who loved him and supported him when he needed supporting and gave him advice when he needed advice. Sansa a happy mother married to a man who would treat her well and give her the world if she so much as asked for it, clever and able to manage a household no matter what challenges came to her. Brandon a valiant and heroic knight with songs written in his honor and telling generations as yet unborn of his valor and courage, and Arya, and Rickon. Don't you make that face at me, Brynden sighed. Seven hells, Kat. What is it that you want me to do? Will you at least speak with them, she asked. If only to tell me where I am going wrong. Fine, Brynden nodded. But only if you promise to never make that face again whilst I am here. Promise. Caitlin laughed, then, as she always had whenever her uncle was around when she was still a little girl at Riverrun. I promise. Your Grace. Brynden said, turning to the king. Will you be telling the boys war stories after the feast is done? I've got plenty of them if they want to hear them, the king answered. Why? You want to tell them about the Ninepenny Kings? I just want to make sure you don't forget to tell them how we saved you at the Stony September, Brynden answered. You, the king roared with laughter. You'll find that was Ned and his Northmen clearing those streets. Connington must have pissed himself when he saw those pikes pouring through the street. We all did our part for victory, her husband answered, never one to accept the glories that others placed upon him. I wouldn't have been able to enter the town so quick if your men hadn't been keeping them off balance. Not like it would have mattered much with how many men you brought to that battle. I think you're forgetting who it was that pushed the royalists back to the Trident whilst you two formed up your armies again, Brynden said, smiling as he raised his cup. Here's to the Targaryens. May they burn in hell. The king laughed then, and the three men, all of them commanders of the rebel armies from the war, clanked their cups together, and when they slumped back into their chairs again, Brynden turned to her with another warm smile. It'll take time, but I'll speak with your sons later in the week, he said, sipping his wine. I need a chance to learn more about them first, since I know little about them other than what they look like and what they are named. Tonight will give me a chance. Thank you, uncle. Well, I came all this way, Brynden answered. I might as well stay a while. Instantly Caitlin knew something was truly wrong, something more than what her uncle wanted her to know. Her father had often been traveling around the Riverlands when she and her siblings were young, forever meeting with one lord or another to keep peace in the Riverlands and to maintain the fragile balance of power that existed between their line and their bannermen, a necessary thing since the Riverlands were not like the North or the Westerlands in how the greatest family in the region could defeat the next two or have a great number of reliable allies with which to support their arms, and that meant that her uncle Brynden had always been the one left with the charge of looking after the three of them, the one they went to with their childhood woes and their questions about the world and their need for advice and guidance, and even the young Petyr Baelish had done so, being treated no different from Edmure even if he was but only a landed knight from the Fingers, the smallest and poorest part of the Vale. He resolved arguments fairly and justly, made equal preparations for them all, and that only changed as they had aged. Caitlin had grown into a young woman who did not need her uncle's advice as much as she once had, and so she did not receive it, whilst Edmure had found friends close to his age who knew him well, and Petyr was simply so clever that he didn't need anyone's advice. Then there was Lysa. Lysa was a girl who the outbreak of war had forced to become a woman before she was truly ready, a lover for songs and stories about heroic knights and perfect charming princes and gentle-hearted women, and the idea that love, true love, could conquer any obstacle. Caitlin had known even then that those were merely tales of how the world should have been rather than how it was, but her sister had not. Her dream had become a nightmare that was all too real, and for that her uncle, having fallen out with their father at the war's end over plans of marriage, had gone with her to the Vale, to help the only one of them who still needed helping, even going with her to King's Landing when Jon Arryn had first become Hand of the King after the chaos that was the fall of the Targaryen Dragon Kings had come to a close. For Brynden to be so ready to leave her was either a sign that she had finally conquered her problems, or that they had conquered her, that the shy maiden who wanted nothing more than a dashing hero that Catelyn remembered as her little sister was no more, and that even her beloved Uncle Brynden had given up. It was that thought and not thirst that made her reach for her wine cup, that thought alone and nothing else. "Cat," her uncle said quietly, his voice a mere murmur over the loud beats and rhythms that echoed off the rafters from the musicians' gallery. "You haven't once touched your food since I've sat down." "I need to know what has happened to my sister, Uncle," she said as quietly as she could. Her uncle sighed, then. "She isn't your sister or my niece anymore, Cat. I don't know who she is." With that she could only stare in quiet disbelief, a stare that was only broken as the music reached its crescendo and came to a halt, the twang of lutes and the pounding of drums and the flaring of flutes all coming to a stop and being replaced by the sound of applause from grateful lords and ladies all well on the way to being drunk. She looked to her ham, then, feeling cold instead of heat, and she took the plate and passed it to a serving girl as they passed by with a tray of finished places and were themselves followed by another girl with a tray covered in new, hot meals, her ham replaced with a thick fillet of northern salmon, a long and thick-bodied fish found in most of the cold water rivers of the north, eating trout and frogs and everything else that got close, but also a fish that had to be quickly brought to Winterfell from the white knife in boxes packed with ice to keep it from rotting in the warmth, making it a rare thing on the table, even for the Starks of Winterfell, and all the greater a sign that the king was a guest of the highest importance. With the new food came a new song, cheerful and happy but slower and less powerful than Robert's favorites, and a new atmosphere. "Come on," Ned Robert said happily as he rose to his feet. "My cup's empty, and so is yours, and if we don't fill them now we won't have a chance before it's all gone." "I thought you were drinking less, Robert?" Eddard asked as he rose, the Lord of Casterly Rock rising with him, for the simple fact that it would be seen strangely for one to not drink when their king did. "And I am the king," laughed. "I've only had 1 cup so far instead of 3. Besides, it's a feast, and feasts are for drinking." And with that, the king started his way down the steps with cup in hand, going towards the barrel of Arbor Gold. "Are you all right, my lady?" her husband asked quietly as Tywin Lannister followed the king, doing what he did, which, in this case, was filling his cup to halfway with Arbor Gold before adding Arbor Red, making some mixture of the two that his grace clearly approved of from the first sip. "I am," she answered, turning to face her husband and seeing a small, cheering smile, and when he went to do the same that Robert did, it was as though her worries for her sister went with him, and she began to eat with the tiny metal pitchfork that was so enormously helpful at the dining table. And rather than look to the queen to her side or to the uncle who brought only grim news, she looked to the rest of the feast hall, to her children, curious as to how they were doing with so grand a feast. Her Rob was trapped between the 2 young women, either of whom could be his bride and the future Lady of Winterfell if he wished it, and was handling it the way that only the heir to Winterfell could, by having their siblings keep their sisters' attentions and to keep them busy whilst he eagerly listened to the tales and stories of the Volanthen tiger sat opposite him, his words out of hearing but surely a captivating tale indeed for Rob to be so utterly entranced by it, and there was no doubt to her that it was yet another tale of Valyrian glory, and not far from them was her husband's bastard, and though he was no son of hers, she could not help but notice that the Lannisters' own bastard girl had been seated next to him, the two quietly talking with one another as the rest of the feast went on around them. On the other side of the dais, past where her husband and the king sat upon their return, was her second son, Brandon, who had been placed between the young and beautiful daughter of the king, Princess Myrcella, who looked like her mother writ small, and on the other side was none other than Sir Barristan Selmy, Lord Commander of the King's Guard and the one member of the King's escort to be sat upon the dais, the rest positioned around the hall so as to guarantee that no assassin, no matter how sudden his attack, would be able to strike a killing blow on the Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, and though it had been hoped that it would be Myrcella who might catch Bran's attention so that he might learn more about life in the south, he was more interested in the veteran knight to his side, his greatest hero and his dream of being a member of the King's Guard made manifest, whilst the princess herself was more curious about the meals that were being placed before her and the stone carvings that decorated the room's columns, telling the history of the Stark line in a more permanent manner than any tapestry, and past those two were Joffrey and Sansa. The royal prince was trying to charm her, that much was ever clear, and Sansa instead had a grim look that would not be out of place on her father, simply nodding and accepting his compliments and flattery and paying no more attention than what was proper and polite whilst looking down the hall towards her own love, Domeric. Her Septa would be proud if she saw her, but it should have been obvious even to Joffrey that Sansa had not even the slightest interest in him, yet the prince went on, trying to charm her with his sweet words and gentle smiles and tender gestures and failing utterly with every attempt. Lastly, on her side of the dais were Arya and Tommen, her daughter looking down to the rest of the feast hall, at Daisy dressed in her long and ladylike dress of green and black and with her hair done long, as she always did during a feast time and for other such formal occasions when there was such an important guest around, and Arya did so with as much uncertainty and doubt as there was wont to be the same, and that feeling meant that the princeling was left to his own devices so as to eat and drink whatever he might possibly want and without his mother or father to tell him otherwise. Though between spoonfuls of sweet things he seemed scared of something for some reason, not that Catelyn could see why, and it was not like Arya to scare little boys, but... "Uncle, what do you think of Arya?" Catelyn asked with clear concern. "Your youngest daughter?" Brynden asked, looking down the table to the one child that looked more like their father than her before turning back to his niece. "She seems nice enough. She helped you with the feast, didn't she? With the seating?" "She normally doesn't like ladylike things like singing and sewing," Catelyn said honestly. "But she likes running a household or helping plan feasts and other things like that." Does she now?" Then he turned to his great niece and what Catelyn saw was like magic. "Your mother tells me you did great helping her with the feast," Brynden said with a soft, approving smile. "You should be proud of yourself." And just so, Arya smiled and seemed even happier than she was already. "You know, it is a lady's work to manage the household so that her husband might focus on greater things," Brynden said, hinting without saying. "They tell the servants what to buy and what not to and what to cook for dinner and where to build, and none can ever tell them otherwise. The lands might be her husband's, but the castle is hers, and for a queen." "What?" Arya asked, a hint of surprise and curiosity in her voice. "And what?" "What the queen says. The realm does," Brynden explained as though it were nothing. "It might be the king who tells his vassals when to raise their banners and when to lower them again, but the queen can tell the realm to feast or not to hold tourneys or not to give to charity or not to. Every woman in the realm looks to her as an example," Brynden said before turning to Cersei. "Isn't that so, Your Grace? How many women are there who wish they were half as beautiful as you?" "Of course it is," Cersei answered with a queen's pride, Arya looking towards her with admiration. "Every woman in the court wishes they were as beautiful as me. They style their hair like mine, and buy dyes to brighten it and wear the same clothes." "See?" Brynden said, looking towards Arya. "When the queen speaks, the realm listens, especially when it is a woman like Visenya who does the speaking." "Visenya?" Arya asked. "Aegon's queen. The one with dark sister?" "Aye, that one," Brynden said between bites. "She was as beautiful as she was strong, or so the singers say. She was the strongest queen that the realm has ever had, even fighting off a dozen assassins to protect her husband before founding the Kingsguard to protect her family." And with that, Arya went quiet and went back to her meal, but it was obvious even to Catelyn that she was thinking. "You can't just tell a girl that she will have to grow up to be a lady," Brynden said. "You have to give them a reason to want to be a lady. They'll do the rest themselves." "But, what if it doesn't work? What if it makes them grow even wilder than they were before?" "It works on boys," Brynden said with another sip of wine before setting his cup down on the table. "And it worked on you." With that, Catelyn went into thought, and not the music, not the change of plates, not the words of her husband and not even the entertaining show that was three men dressed as the Targaryen dragon getting their heads whacked off by another dressed like a stag with a giant hammer could bring her back out of it, and she realized that if Arya could not be made into a lady, then perhaps, she could be made into a queen. Asterisk 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 asterisk. End of part 18. Notes. Fun. Laughing smiley. I'll admit that this part changed quite a bit from what I initially planned, since the original plan for the part would have meant starting halfway through the feast rather than during it, but that didn't work quite right, so we went back to the start of it, which threw a lot of my other plans off and forced me to sew things together again and, Well, I think things came out rather good anyway, since once the part began to flow from there, it just wouldn't stop. But I will also say that some of the themes that I had wanted to cover in this part will likely be covered in the next instead, something which will likely result in a chunkier part 19, but there's nothing wrong with that. Part 19 was going to be a pretty big one anyway, laughing smiley. And on to the summary of this part. Well, where to start? It's a bit late, so there won't be a big summary for this one, but to start from the top, we see the little northern tradition of allowing one's honored guest to tap the barrel, as was mentioned in the previous part, and King Robert, ever a lover of booze and hammering things, most certainly enjoyed that part of his stay in Winterfell, and from there, things got rolling indeed, with Catelyn and Cersei making some diplomatic small talk, Tywin Lannister making notes of what it is that allows Winterfell to remain habitable even in the coldest, darkest winters. And then Brynden Tully arrived. If you remember one of the earlier Catelyn parts, you'll remember just how stumped Catelyn was with her children and how things weren't exactly going to plan. Sansa was fine, if frustrating, but Arya's ferocity was something that she had little idea on how to tame, and her sons were little better, and how she sent a raven to the Eyrie, and so Brynden came to Riverrun to lend a helping hand, and though he might not have any children of his own, Brynden is very, very good at this sort of thing. What with practically raising the Tully siblings all by himself. His style of parenting is rather different than Catelyn's or even Tywin's, in that he doesn't push them along to the end goal and make them conform to the role that society expects them to have. He makes them want to go along to the end goal themselves and is entirely ready to accept a few kinks here and there in the end result, and Arya is his first crack at it with the Stark children. If you remember some of her earliest parts in A Game of Thrones, you'll remember that she was actually rather saddened by the fact that she couldn't do the things that Sansa could do, like how she was regularly scolded for her needlework by Septa Mordane simply because she could never live up the standards that her perfect sister set, and was mocked by Sansa's friends to the point that she started to take the things that they said into herself, starting to see herself as ugly and flawed, and so on. Now, that sort of thing hasn't happened to her in this timeline. That's already rather clear, what with Daisy acting like a role model to her and keeping her well away from that sort of negative influence, being more like a big sister to her than not. But like in canon, Daisy is the sort of woman who doesn't mind doing what society expects of her when it is expected. She still wears dresses at feasts, even if she doesn't do sewing at other times or anything of that sort, and would rather go hunting in the woods or knock someone's block off in bare-knuckle boxing than sing or do any of the traditionally ladylike things, and hence Arya's confusion and hesitation in the part. She deeply admires Daisy, as evident from all of her earlier parts, but she doesn't understand how she can be both, how Daisy can still be the strong woman she loves at one time and then wear dresses and dance at another. She doesn't realize that Daisy is not the extreme, but the middle ground between women like, say, Asha Greyjoy and her own sister. And what Brynden says goes a great deal in mending that divide. He's saying that a woman doesn't need to commit to one side or the other, but can balance both the same way a knight can be the deadliest thing on the battlefield and yet a gentle and kind soul when at home and in times of peace. And we know that there are definitely women in Asoyaf who fit that role. Visenya Targaryen, as mentioned in the part above, is the perfect example. She cut down a number of people who were there to see her and Aegon dead. Yet not long after she took personal charge in helping her nephew Inys recover, and maybe murdered him the process, but that's besides the point, tongue-poking smiley. And with that, Catelyn starts getting a rather interesting idea of copying the same method. Chapter 19, Rob 3. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Asterisk 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 asterisk. After the feast, Rob slumped back into his seat as the servants began clearing away the plates and cups of the many men and women who already retired for the evening, those of the royal retinue who had spent a long time traveling on the roads and were looking forward to a long night in a warm and soft bed, and those who had spent much of the day exploring the city and seeing what the heart of northern civilization, the place where the culture of the first men was at its strongest, had to offer, and with them had went their guides and other Northmen who were simply tired out by the day of greeting and feasting. Almost all the ladies that were his sister's friends were gone from the hall, with many but not all of their brothers having gone with them at their insistence, but despite that most of his wolves were still there alongside him, occasionally picking at the platters of sweet southern fruits that were a rarity in the north and slowly drinking the warm and spiced cider that was the traditional after-meal drink of the first men, something to warm one's belly for when they crawled beneath the blankets. A small part of Rob was tempted to do the same, to call it now and go back to his own bed so as to be able to rise early tomorrow, but there was one thing that his Volunteer tutor had suggested to be done first, one opportunity that had been given earlier in the day and that he refused for anything, and one that he had bargained with his father for the chance to have. "So you lot are the ones that stayed to listen to me talk about the war, eh?" Robert laughed as he walked through the emptying hall and pulled out a chair by their table, Sir Barristan Selmy following his lord and Rob's younger brother Brandon following the two and himself followed by a curious Arya, with Brynden the Blackfish not far behind. "You've probably all heard Ned talk about the war now and then, but he wasn't with me for half of it." Rob smiled at the sight of the king, who could ever turn down a chance to speak with the demon of the Trident himself, the living legend that had smashed the royalists in every battle and done the same to the Dragon Prince when he came out of hiding. He was like a hero of song and myth made into flesh and blood, and his deeds in the name of the woman he loved, a Stark woman, had done much to mend the wounds that the Targaryens had made in the long bond between North and South with their monstrous deeds. "My father doesn't like talking about the war," he said truthfully and to the king's obvious surprise. "He says there was little glory in it." "Your father was always too damned humble for his own good." Robert laughed again as he fell into his seat. "He's been that way since we met at the Eyrie. How about you? Do you think there was glory in what we did?" "You defeated 3 armies in a single day," Rob said as the others looked towards their king with interest and awe and respect, even Horono Veneris. No one had ever done it before. "I." "The Battle of Summerhall," the king grinned, leaning onto the table and rolling up his sleeves, the golden cloth bulging from the tightness of the thick muscles behind. "Gods! What a battle it was! Did those tutors of yours tell you that we only had 3 men for every 4 of theirs, and only a few more horses to make up the difference? How did you win when the enemy had a quarter more men?" Torrhen Karstark asked with amazement. His brother sat besides, half asleep in his seat and still awake by willpower alone. "They should have overwhelmed you." The king smiled as Daisy found herself a seat alongside the others, Arya looking towards her only to get an approving nod from the Mormont woman. "They would have, but their armies were separated from one another by the terrain," Robert said, starting to explain, taking 3 leftover knives from around the table and scrunching up the cloth to make the hills and land and arranging the knives just so that their sharpest points indicated the way they were marching. "Summerhall didn't have walls since the Targaryens thought they wouldn't need any, but they built it on a hill just in case. Said it was to get a good view of the beautiful Stormlands and so it could be seen from a distance, but it wasn't 50 years before that they had made war on Dorne and knew what good a hill could do to protecting a castle." "But what good is a hill for a castle without walls?" the Smalljan asked. "Even the wildlings build walls around their camps." "See, Summerhall was in the Dornish marches," the king explained. "The mountains meant that they would have protection to the south and rough terrain all around to slow down an advance, and the castle itself was out of the way. It wouldn't be important enough to attack first, not whilst Blackhaven still stood to the south and Stony Helm to the east. The castle's only value is the position it has, and nothing more, not even the symbolism. Dragonstone has that. That's why the Black Fires never went for it," Veneris said, taking a small drink of the hot cider before setting his cup down on the table to let it cool a little more. "It would only be useful if they already had a way into the Stormlands and needed a place to put their armies together." "Exactly," Robert said. "Summerhall is close to the middle of the Stormlands. It's the perfect rally point, and the Royalists knew it. I had just made my way back to the Stormlands from Gulltown and was assembling my own forces when I found out that the Catherans, the Fells and the Grandisons were more loyal to Aerys than to me, and that they had been gathering their swords, planning to put their armies together so as to hold me in the Stormlands long enough for their reinforcements to arrive, but they hadn't had a chance to do so. I was still gathering my forces, but I knew I had to stop them before they had a chance to combine arms," the king continued as a serving woman came over and put a slowly steaming cup in front of him. "So I marched west." "Isn't Felwood on the way to Summerhall?" Rob asked. "How did you get past them?" "I took a path through the Kingswood," the man for whom Rob was named answered, swilling his cup around to stir the spices within. "Lord Fell had last fought in the War of the Ninepenny Kings, and not very well. He had lost one of his sons on what was meant to be a simple scouting mission on Bloodstone, trying to find out where the Golden Company and its allies were camped and if there was any good terrain between the 2 armies for a battle," Brynden added. Melis Lot had found a deserter of 3 days who told them about the mission and wiped out the whole party in an ambush, using trapdoors buried in the ground and covered with sand. Very clever, Veneris approved, Rob agreeing in silence. It was, and that had ruined the man, Robert sighed before continuing on. Made him cautious of losing more men in the same way, so he hardly ever sent out outriders, yet alone outriders in his own lands. That's how we managed to make our way past without him noticing. Once we were through his lands, it was an easy march on the castle, but the spring rains came quick and washed out the roads, and though they slowed us down, they made the royalists wait a few days for the ground to harden again, lest their horses get bogged down in the mud. And that let us reach Summerhall first, Robert said with a growing smile. The castle was a burnt-out ruin, half of it was collapsed, and it hadn't any men to guard it. It was little better than old stones. If there were enough bits of stonework around to say that it was a castle, then it is far better off than old stones, Brynden said quietly. But I put my men to work, Robert said. We sealed up some of the more damaged parts of the castle with stone and moved the debris around the courtyard to make it seem like a tower had fallen, blocking off the eastern view of the main courtyard. Then we went inside, and brought our horses behind the wall. From a distance, the castle looked even worse off than it was when we arrived, and it looked empty. Rob leaned forward, then, smiling as he realized what was about to be said. The Thorntons came first, trumpeting their horns to try and signal to their allies that they had arrived, only to hear silence, and so they started setting camp to rest after their long march through the horrid weather, Robert said, his voice lowering. They drank, they feasted, and they went to sleep dreaming of victory, and when the sun rose tomorrow. He trailed off to silence. And then Robert slammed his fist off the table with all his might, making even the fearless Umber seem to recoil into his chair from the suddenness of his strike. We wiped them out, he started, Robert's powerful voice booming off the rafters above as only the drums had before, taking Rob to the midst of the battlefield, to the clash of steel on steel. We stormed them whilst they were still in their beds, blaring our horns as we charged down the hills. Half of their men thought it was their allies come to reinforce them, but when they heard the men cheering my name they ran for their arms and armor, but by then, it was over, and their entire army, nearly 1,000 men, were either dead or my prisoners. How did you hold so many prisoners when there were more enemies on the way? Rob asked, curious. Wouldn't they have rebelled when Lord Fell arrived? These men were sworn to their lord, and their lord was my hostage, Robert said. We put them into what was left of Summerhall and left them there. With Lord Caffin kept by my side, they couldn't escape without guaranteeing that they would die, and it gave me a chance to talk Lord Caffin onto our side. He died at Ashford, but I would be damned if I didn't say that he fought harder for us than he ever did for the dragons. Anyway, the king said next, relaxing into his seat once more. We formed up for battle, next, since we knew the sound of our horns would have been heard by the Grandisons, who we had been told had set march the day before and were expected to arrive that day. I split my horse into 2 groups, sending them east and west, just over the hills, and waited with my foot outside Summerhall, on the flattest bit of land I could find, and not long after all that was done we saw the sleeping lion on their banners coming over the hills. His men must have been tired out from the march, Rob said. They were, but he urged them on anyway, Robert answered with an approving nod. He had been worried about being caught by me on his way to Summerhall and picked off, so he had force-marched his men day and night to get them there, through the rain too. They charged, but their heart wasn't in it anymore, not after they saw the fallen Caffin banners there too. When my horse looped around and struck their flanks and rear, they shattered like glass. What about Lord Fell? He came last, and we were ready for him when he did, the warrior king smiled. He moved like a tortoise, slow but certain, till he came to a halt on the hills and dared us to come to him, his men in one long shield wall bristling with pikes and blades. Even with superior numbers, pushing up a hill would be hard, and my men were worn out from the other 2 battles. I could have taken the hill, but not without losing much of my army, so I did something else. You feinted by staging a mock withdrawal from the field so as to incite Lord Fell to advance down the hill and give up his position, Veneris said, leaning forward. Then you turned around, catching him by surprise with a frontal and 3-pronged assault to break his shield wall apart on the, then driving the resulting wedge into the center of his forces where you slew him in single combat. You had to ruin the surprise, didn't you? Robert laughed before asking, curious. How did you know about that part, anyway? Do they tell stories about the rebellion in Volantis? Of course, the tiger answered with a smile. The old Valyrian freeholders liked to stay aware of whatever wars were being waged in the world, so that they would have a chance to learn of any new tactics or weapons and whether or not they might have a place in their own armies. Volantis is the same, but we also like to hear of our western cousins getting what they deserve from time to time. And we gave them what they deserved, all right, Robert grinned. We smashed them up and down the south from the Stormlands to the Riverlands before Tywin Lannister finished the job. But they did get one victory, didn't they? Robb asked, hoping to hear how such a great general had been driven from the field. At Ashford. Then Robb realized that he should not have mentioned that battle nor said that word, for the king fell quiet and all the joy went out of him, Robert falling back into his seat and letting out a sigh, resting his head on his right hand as if afraid to show his shame. Ashford was a mistake, J.E. said with a low voice, not much louder than a whisper. What happened at Ashford? Came the confused voice of Robb's sister, Arya, not having had the same level of military tuition as any of the men or boys around her, with it being the usual for girls to learn more about the diplomatic side of things, the marriages that had created the Grand Alliance that had brought down the Dragon Kings and why there was a war in the first place, similar but not the same to the boys who were taught how the war was fought instead. Arya, you shouldn't ask the king about that, Daisy said softly whilst giving Arya a look that silenced any complaint. Ashford was the one and only battle between the rebels and the Tyrells during the war, Brynden Tully said quietly so that the king would not hear. It did not go well. Many men loyal to Robert left their lives on that field in a rearguard action, stopping the Tyrells from chasing him down. If what you say is true, then the entire victory over the Targaryens can be placed on their shoulders, Veneris said, having somehow heard the Blackfish from further down the table. They died heroes' deaths. They died bravely and they died with honor, the king said, looking towards the ground and consumed by a somber and tearless grief. They died fighting in my name, but they still died. Your Grace, perhaps it would be best to tell them another tale. The Lord Commander of the King's Guard said. Your duel with Prince Rhaegar is always a good tale and you tell it well. For a moment, there was silence. And then Robert leaned forward again, taking a long sip of wine again before placing the silver cup on the table and wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, only a few hints of his previous anguish left to hint at what had happened only a few moments before. And what a fight that was, Robert started, drawing in the attentions of all, even some of the servants who were still in the hall clearing the other tables. I had been to dozens of tourneys that had Rhaegar amongst those riding there, and I never once had a chance to fight him. I thought he couldn't be too hard. He never fought in any of the melees at any of the tourneys, staying in the joust instead, so I thought he just stayed with what he was good at doing. Besides, what harpist ever killed anyone before? Robb laughed with his family and his wolves, and said, Valero the Vanquisher. Who's Valero? Robert asked his younger namesake, interested. He was a Valyrian general in command of a siege army during the Second Turtle War, Robb said as his Volanten tutor watched closely. He found a Rhoynish prince trying to get his forces past a fast-flowing river, so he had his men set up their scorpions and catapults and played his harp whilst they sank all the barges that tried to cross. Robert laughed, then, and so did the others. And how many men did he kill doing that? The prince thought if he sent lots of barges at once he could overwhelm him and get ashore, Robb said as Horono nodded in approval. He lost 800 men since their armor dragged them under. Well, I meant a harpist killing someone by themselves, Robert said with amusement, growing more serious. Anyway, let me tell you, I was expecting an easy fight against the Dragon Prince, and he gave me anything but. It was close. How close? Bran asked with barely concealed excitement. Do you want to see how close it was? Robert asked. Bran nodded. In response, Robert rose from his seat once more, unfastening the buttons of his doublet and throwing it around the back of his seat, showing just how immensely built the warrior king of the Seven Kingdoms was, greater in bulk than even the small Janumba or Donal Snowstock, even through the linen shirt beneath. Undoing its top 4 buttons, he pulled the left side open, revealing his bared breast. And the most grisly scar that Robb had ever seen in his life, a horrid round and lumpy patch of discolored skin, 2.5 inches to the bottom left of the nipple. Robb's jaw dropped at the sight of it, and all of them looked to their king with stunned amazement, for what they saw was not the scar of any slash wound, but the last remaining hint of a stab that should have killed any man, even the king. The maesters say if it had been even half an inch further up. Robert snapped his fingers. The gods old and new must have been smiling on me then, since it damn well nearly went all the way through. Seven hells, Brindon the Blackfish muttered under his breath as he leaned close. I heard you took a wound, but I thought it but a scratch or two, not anything like this. How in the seventh's name did it happen? Roriger had found a dent in my armor caused by some fool thinking they could stab through plate like in the stories, Robert said as he sat down again, buttoning his shirt up once more. They had put all their strength in the strike and had it hit at an angle that caused a dent, but did nothing more. When I was fighting Roriger, I was too quick for him to hit any of the joints in the armor and he never got the chance to make those strikes in the first place, but he could hit my breastplate enough to weaken it further. I didn't notice it at the time, the king continued. But all those blows had deformed the plate enough that a stab wouldn't be able to roll off the armor anymore, but you'd need a thin blade of good metal to get through, to put all the force on one point. So he dropped his sword, pulled out a Valyrian steel dagger and stabbed the dent as quick as he could and with all the strength he had left. Then Robert laughed. I hadn't even realized I had been stabbed at first, the king said as all watched in silence. I just crushed his left knee with a blow from my hammer to send him crashing to the ground before bringing it down on his head. You wouldn't have been able to tell he was a Targaryen after that. The royalists heard the strike and saw him fall, and they ran. Brindon led the charge that swept the last of them from the field, and I made it around 20 feet before I collapsed and passed out. Then I woke up a day later with the maester, Jon Arryn, your father, and a septon giving me my last rites, and that was that, the king finished. How did the maester save you? Jon asked with amazement. I was lucky, Robert said with a shrug of his shoulders. He means he was too stubborn to die, Brindon said, the king laughing. Roriger mustn't have hit anything important. That was the maester's guess, and Grand Maester Pycelle took a look after the war and said the same as well, Robert said. I'll tell you though, it woke me up. It made me realize that if I had been even a second slower than I was then it would have been me who died that day, not him. His Grace has made sure to practice his skill at arms regularly since that day, the Lord Commander of the King's Guard informed the gathered Northmen. I would say that he is an even greater warrior now than he was then. It helps to keep me sharp, Robert smiled before starting to ask questions of his own. Anyway, what do you boys know about the South? Did Ned or Cat ever tell you much about it? Not too much, Rob said truthfully as the wolves of Winterfell watched and nodded with his words. We know about the faith, knights and the kingdoms, but none of us have actually ever been there for ourselves. So, like me and the North, eh? Robert japed, getting a laugh out of them all. I'm hoping to try and get that father of yours to come down with me to King's Landing, help me pick up from where Jon Arryn had left off before he died, and might be we could have a chance to return the hospitality, the king said with a warm smile. Show you all how we feast in the land of summer, and show you how we live too. You would welcome us to King's Landing? Rob asked, surprised. To the Red Keep. Of course, Robert laughed. The North might be far away from the South, so far that we barely ever get a chance to interact with one another, but we're still friends. The North and the South, the First Men and the Andals, the gods old and new, they go together like bread and butter, and the rebellion proved it. Your families helped me win my throne, only fair that you all get a chance to see what it was that they fought for. Rob looked to his half-brother, then, to Jon, and he smiled. A chance to visit the Southern Realms was a rare thing, one his father would not easily allow, not if it meant being away from Winterfell for too long, but to have the king extend the invitation, to be offered royal hospitality in the Red Keep itself, who could ever say no to such a thing, without being seen to have rejected the generous offer of their king and ally. The South was a place that was similar but different to the North, and distant, but that made it only all the more tempting to visit. Would they have bare-fisted melees there like they did in the North, or would they have set aside such a tradition in favor of something else, something Rob had never known before? Would they have truly cut down their godswoods, or would they still have wood trees in their castles, with their own faces so utterly different from those in the North? Would it be the land of unending green and golden sunlight that he had always been told that it was, a land where seeds could simply be thrown onto the soil to grow with no effort and where the fruits grew so large on the trees as to be bigger than his fist? He didn't know, but he wanted to find out, but how could he? He would have to go south, and he could only go south if his father went south, but if he could talk his lord father into going with the king, Then Rob would be able to go with him, for a time, since he knew he would have to return to Winterfell before long to rule in his father's stead, and see all that the heart of the South had to offer just as the royal family had in Winterfell. And who knows what he could do whilst in the South. There would be dozens of battlefields just on the way from Winterfell to King's Landing, and hundreds more in easy reach. He could visit the Trident where the last and greatest battle of Robert's rebellion had been fought, or even go to the west shore of the God's Eye Lake where the winter wolves had charged the forest of Lannister spears 5 times till the Westermen ran into the lake, willing to risk death by drowning rather than face the certainty of being run through on a northern lance. The bloodiest battle of the entire Dance of the Dragons, and a crushing defeat for the Greens that they nearly didn't recover from. Then there was the Bloody Meadow that had been the site of the final battle of the first and greatest of the Blackfyre rebellions, the Battle of the Redgrass Field that had been the place of Demon Blackfyre's legendary charge, or the Field of Fire, or Wailing Willows, or the Last Storm, or... I don't need to ask your answer to know what you want, Robert said to Rob as he grinned. You want to see the Trident? I'll take you there on the way south and show you the exact spot I caved in Rhaegar's helm, and that goes for all of you. Then there was a cheer from around the table, the noise of friends as enthusiastic about the idea of visiting the southern kingdoms as Rob himself was, and just like his brother Jon, grinning widely at the thought of being able to visit such places for himself. Even the Volanten citizen was seemingly content with the idea, eager to allow them a chance to see such historic battlefields for themselves. All that meant that there was only the small matter of convincing his father into letting them go, but that would surely not be too difficult. After all, it was not as if they were going to spend much more than a month there at most, and that was a little enough time that Winterfell and the North would be able to run without either of them. We're going to have to get father to take us south with him, Rob said to his half-brother. I've always wanted to see the Trident. It was one of the biggest battles Westeros has ever had. That's if he is going south, Jon reasoned. What if he doesn't want to go? Then we'll have to talk him into going, Rob smiled as Bran leaned over and nodded in agreement. If me, you and Bran all ask for him to go south, he'll go south. It won't be for a time, yet, Robert said to the 3 of them. It took me a month to come all this way up here, I might as well stay for a week or 2. Give your father time to think about what I said. I think he'll be happy to go with you, Your Grace, Rob said. I could talk to him though. Then Rob smiled again as the king looked on, and he said quietly, for a trip to Summerhall. Robert roared with laughter, then, striking his palm off the table. A deal. Jon laughed with the rest of the wolves. You bargained with the king. And now we get to go to Summerhall with him, Rob smiled. Can I come? Arya asked, hopeful. I don't see why not, so long as your father allows you to come, the king shrugged before looking at her and Daisy in confusion. And actually, why are you 2 here? I hadn't thought any ladies here would be interested enough in my war stories to stay up so late to listen to them. There's no reason why northern ladies can't do it if they want to, Daisy answered as Arya looked on. Besides, who wouldn't want to hear you talking about smashing Targaryens? Other Targaryens, Horono said with mild amusement. And what's your story, Horono? Robert asked, curious. How did you get so far away from home? My story, as you Westerosi call it, is little to talk about, the tiger answered. I learned the way of war from the greatest mind in such things alive, and decided to spread such knowledge so that it might not die out. I don't remember teaching you, Robert said as a jape, making all those who were around him laugh. Go on. There is little more to it than that, Your Grace, Veneris answered, swilling his wine slowly. But if you are curious to know more, then I suppose I may as well say more. I am from within the Black Walls, the true heart of Volantis, as you can no doubt tell by my appearance and manners. My people are the last of Valyria's true heirs, keeping to the ways of the freehold even 400 years since the Doom, and it is a pleasant place where the rule of law is strong and where rulers and the course of the freehold is determined by elections. My people are pleasant to be around, truly, but I desired a chance to see how the peoples of other lands lived, and so here I am, Veneris finished. Besides, it keeps me out of the politicking at home. As a man from the Red Keep, you must understand how tiresome it gets to deal with that sort of thing. More than you realize, Robert sighed. So, you named for that general of theirs? Ah, you mean Horono, Veneris said with a smile, pleased to know that the Westerosi king knew some of the city's history. No. His name was banned after the revolt. But you're named Horono? Robb asked with surprise. And I am Veneris answered. My name is spelled differently, with 2 Rs and 1 N. His was the other way around. Completely different. Well, I best be getting to bed before that wife of mine thinks I've taken the black or something, the king japed, rising from his seat and taking his doublet from its back, throwing it around his shoulders as though it were a coat. We'll talk more tomorrow, eh? Of course, Your Grace, Robb said, stretching out in his own seat with a yawn that his brothers John and Bran soon caught. My father didn't want me up too late tonight, so I best be going as well, and it'd probably be good for everyone else to do the same. There was a murmur of acknowledgements and agreements all around the table, then, with Torrhen Karstark poking his sleeping brother before shaking him awake as Robb and his brother downed what was left of their now lukewarm drink, just as the rest of the wolves did, rising from their seats and allowing the last few servants left to clear the table. The king turned and went, the Lord Commander following close behind, and Brynden Tully looked around for a moment, confused, and Robb was about to offer him directions when the Blackfish started off on his way back to his own chambers, wherever they were in the castle. Then, with every minute that passed, the few wolves of his that had remained up so late began heading off to their own chambers, following Daisy and Arya out, and Robb followed, with Jon at his side, striding towards the doors that were besides the dais and led towards the steps that were the way to his chambers. Robb, may I speak with you for a moment? His Volanthen mentor asked, rising to his feet. Of course, Robb answered before turning his head towards his half-brother. It shouldn't take too long. I'll wait for you by the stairs, then Jon said before smiling. Someone needs to make sure you make it up the steps well with how much wine you drank. Your mother would never believe me if I said you slipped. I'm not that drunk, Jon. Robb laughed as he walked across the room again, towards his mentor, the only ones in the hall. What is it? Be careful around that man, Veneris warned quietly. He is more cunning than you might think, his battlefield strategy is proof enough of that. Who? Robb asked, as quiet as he was concerned. The king, the Volanthen answered, rising to his full height at last, leaving the cup upon the table. Do you truly think that it is by coincidence that the Lord Paramount of the Westerlands and the King of the Seven Kingdoms come to Winterfell immediately after the death of the Lord Paramount of the Vale and the Hand of the King? I don't think Robert had anything to do with that, Robb said, certain of his words. Father says that he was like another son to Jon Arryn. And neither do I think that Robert had anything to do with it, the Volanthen said softly. But I think that the two of them know more than they are willing to say, and that whatever it is surely of importance for the two to travel from one side of the realm to the other so abruptly. Then the Volanthen went quiet, arms crossed and deep in silent thought. He clearly means to make your father Hand of the King, he said at last. That is an obvious fact, and one you must have already realized by now, and he means to use you and your friends and their desire to visit the south as a means to encourage your father into doing the same. But why is Tywin Lannister here? Robb's eyes narrowed as the Volanthen spoke. He could not be here to try and take the position for himself, for he would have had plenty of opportunity to make his position known at King's Landing, years before the death of Jon Arryn. His family's influence at court, certainly great with his daughter as the king's bride, would have made it easy to assume power even if the Hand kept the title, so it is certain he cannot be after the position. Then, what? Robb asked, his best wits clouded by drink and tiredness. If King Robert wishes to make my father Hand and Tywin Lannister doesn't want the position, then what is the problem? The problem is Tywin Lannister, Veneris explained quickly. He should not be here without a reason, and tell me, what reason is there that could send the Lord of Casterly Rock, one of the most powerful men in the south, on a journey towards one of the most powerful men in the north? It has to be important, Robb said. Maybe Lord Tywin knows something important. Something about the death of Jon Arryn. Perhaps, but I would think that unlikely, Veneris said, dismissing the thought. If that was the case, then he could have simply passed the message on to the king or to the queen and had it delivered without needing to leave the Westerlands and without putting himself in harm's way, and in any case the Lannisters are bound to the crown, their interests match those of Robert, so they would have been able to give him the information directly and had him deal with the matter before he came to Winterfell in the first place. Unless he believes that the Lannister position at King's Landing is not so secure as it should be, the Tiger said with growing realization. It would seem the Lion of Lannister thinks that something is afoot in the capital, and that whatever information he has must be delivered to your father in person and with the least risk of discovery. But what does this have to do with Robert? Why would Tywine come with the king if? And then it fell into place. Tywine's here because he realizes that the king is tired of Lannisters, Robb said, speaking as quickly as he could think. He knows that whatever secret he's found, the king won't believe it because he will think it is an excuse to expand Lannister power at court. He needs to tell my father so my father can tell Robert, because anything important that my father tells Robert will have the king act. Precisely, Veneris said, nodding. It would seem we have some intrigues afoot. Then, what do we do? Robb asked. Should we tell my father? No, Veneris said at last. Sometimes knowing the move that someone is going to make and why they are doing so is more valuable than gold. Like a leader of a kingdom at war, sometimes it can be best to wait and see what one's opponent is doing, so that their true goal might be revealed and planned for. We will wait. Quick thinking means quick mistakes. Robb nodded, and then the door beside the dais opened again, and Jon peeked through. Are you coming? I apologize for keeping your brother so long, Veneris said with a deep and respecting bow, taking Robb's bastard brother by surprise with his deference. I best retire for the evening myself. I will see you again tomorrow. And with that, the Volanthen turned and exited, walking to one of the staircases besides the great hall that led to the chambers that were attached directly onto the side of the great hall's upper levels, a place where the castle's visiting entertainers and the like might rest in an almost lordly comfort between their shows, leaving Robb to cross the hall to his brother alone. What was that about? Jon asked, tired but curious. You were talking for longer than I thought you would. It was nothing much, Robb answered. Just another lesson about politics. Another? Jon asked with surprise. Just how many times has he spoken to you about all that? More than you know, Robb said wearily. I probably know more about how Volantis works than the Volanthens do. Does father know he's teaching you that? Jon asked, curious. He must do, Robb reasoned with a shrug of his shoulders as they exited out into the hallway behind the great hall, quiet but for the soft sound of their footsteps and the occasional creaking of the slowly cooling fortress. He's the one who hired him, and he's very, very clever. Do you really think he got bored of Volantis, though? Jon asked, concerned. Half of Westeros wouldn't let a man who knew armies half as well as him go wherever they want. I think he is telling the truth, Robb replied as they climbed up the steps. I don't think he would lie about it. There isn't a need to. Even if they banished him from the city for whatever reason, Volantis has no power here. Then he looked to his brother and smiled. How were things between you and Joy? With that, his brother made a sound that was half a laugh and half a sigh, for both Robb and Jon knew full well why the bastard niece of the Lord of Casterly Rock had been brought to Winterfell and introduced to the castle's own, unmarried and unbetrothed bastard. Busy. She wanted me to escort her around the city since she had never been to the north before. So I did. And? Robb teased. Is she going to be Lady Snow? She wants to be, Jon answered, embarrassed by the question. I showed her everything I thought she might be interested in. I took her to the marketplace and showed her the things on sale, the wood trees that they have watching the stalls, everything. What did she think of it all? She was curious about everything, like why we have the trees there, Jon answered. But other than things like that, I barely ever had to explain anything about our ways to her, since she could figure it all out on her own. She's very intelligent, but she reminds me of her uncle. She doesn't smile because she's happy, she smiles because she's expected to smile, and you can tell. But she was happy, wasn't she? I think so, Jon answered with a sigh. She's like a statue. She can hide her feelings so well that I can't tell if she's happy or not. She seemed to be interested, though. She asked a lot of questions, nothing dangerous, just things like how people go from one place to another at the start of spring when the snow is only starting to melt, or how the houses have enough food to last the whole winter. Did she ask anything about you? More than I knew how to answer, Jon said, laughing to himself. She wanted to know how I was raised, if it was different from her own experiences. Her uncles treated her well, but he's made sure she never forgot that she was a bastard, whilst father lets you feel as though you were trueborn. Rob asked with a low and quiet voice. Sometimes, John said, smiling slightly. I know Lady Stark doesn't like it, but sometimes I do feel like we're full brothers, not half ones. Joy never had any of that. She didn't have half-brothers or half-sisters, just cousins, and she didn't even get a chance to really know her own father before he disappeared whilst out looking for Brightraw. She's only ever really had Tywin, Rob said. So that's probably why she takes after him. I think you're right, John answered. But she's softer than her uncle. She doesn't smile much, she doesn't like to talk unless she's been spoken to first or anything like that, but she does have a gentler side. She showed it at the table. Does she have a harder side, though? Rob asked. It can be difficult in the north. You've seen how Mother, Lady Stark is, in her September by herself. I don't know, John answered honestly. If she has won, she hasn't shown it. I wouldn't be surprised if she doesn't act like her uncle entirely, then. But do you think? Think what? Should I marry her? John asked, quiet and hesitant. I can't answer that for you, Rob laughed as they reached the top of the stairs, his brother glaring at him coldly. Sorry, John. But I can't. I mean, there are reasons to, John said as he considered carefully. I don't know if we would love each other, but I think we could be friends. And she's clever and would come with a good dowry, so we could make a good start with the lands we get. John, you're not even 6 and 10, Rob said with amusement. Father won't want any of us marrying till then anyway, just so we all know what we're doing, and you mightn't get your land till you're 20. Arnulf Snowstoke didn't get his till then, and he put his first man in the ground at 8. Do you think I should wait, then? John asked. I mean, she's been hinting at it, hasn't she? Rob asked with crossed arms. Trying to get you to make a betrothal before you've had a chance to think on it. A little. Well, don't, Rob said with a shrug. You've got years before then, and it's not like she'll be married off before then either. You're the best marriage she can wish for, and her uncle knows it. I'm being stupid, aren't I? John said, laughing as his half-brother nodded and as the two stood before the well-sealed door that kept the cold of the stairwell from coming onto the floor where the Stark children slept. I'll speak with her tomorrow when I get the chance. She'll probably like that I want to take my time with it, seeing as she takes after her uncle so. Then there was a scared yelp from the other side of the door, a cry that Rob knew to be his pup's and a cry that made his pulse roar in his ears in an instant. He grabbed the handle and threw the door open with his left hand and reached for a knife with his right, his hand finding nothing, and when the door opened, he saw the scared, little direwolf pup that was his own, still small and still young and still dependent on his mother for food, with so thick a coat of fur as to make his legs almost invisible in the thick grey that was the very same color as his family's banners, huddling beside his door, tiny little markings left in the wood where it had been scratching, and it looked towards the window at the end of the hall, still open and still letting in a draught, still revealing the pitch black darkness of the outside world, and the sleeping city that was barely lit by starlight and a few of the city's oil lamps, kept burning in summertime so as to get their attendants practiced and ready for doing so in winter and autumn. The tiny direwolf's head snapped towards its master, and it ran across the floor as quickly as it could, terrified, and Rob bent down, picking up his grey wolf. His mother had thought it best for them to be separated from their wolves for a little time, to avoid the risk of scaring the royals, and the Schwolf had surely agreed and gathered them up in a warm part of the castle before wrapping herself around, something that his pup must have surely found a way to escape. He held it close against him, trying to soothe its fear with a quiet, reassuring hum and a gentle touch of the back of his hand, but the pup was utterly terrified, trembling with fear against him, with his tiny tail tucked away and with paws desperately reaching for a place to hide in, even a pocket. "Gods," he said, rubbing his wolf's little body. "What's gotten into you? You've never been this scared before." "It must be the window," John said, striding across the hallway with cautious side steps and with fists clenched, ready for a fight even without a weapon close at hand. "Is someone there?" There was the fluttering of broken wings, and a sound the likes of which he had never heard before, a sound that sent chills running down his spine and made the pups cry in utter terror. John looked back towards his brother with fear, true fear, and then he looked out into the darkness, reaching out onto the roof of the castle with a bare and trembling hand. And then he pulled back a raven. It fluttered in his grip, half trying to take flight and half trying to swoop and half trying to land, utterly confused and utterly mad, and it made a shrill and piercing cry that stabbed to his soul, its beak snapping out in all directions. It shook wildly in John's grip as Rob's bastard brother brought it in with eyes stunned by the sight before them, the bird crying crimson tears as its mouth frothed with white foam like a rabid beast, and Rob thought to shout to his brother to drop the damned thing, to throw it out and back into the darkness from whence it came, but the words choked in his throat, suffocated by unnatural terror as he watched the convulsing bird shaking, trying to do everything and nothing at once. This was not right, his mind screamed, this was not natural, his body shouted, run, his instincts commanded. Then it went silent. The bird fell still, dead. The air changed. Normalcy returned. Rob. John said with shaking hands and cheeks covered in tears. It has 3 eyes. Asterisk 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 asterisk. End of part 19. Notes. And boy oh boy oh boy, was this a fun part to write. I'd give you all a summary, but I'm just sitting down to dinner and, what the heck, I'm sure you all can handle this part without any explanation of the things in it, Laughing smiley. Chapter 20, Viserys 2. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Somewhere in the summer sea. Viserys smiled widely to himself as the small merchantman's off-white sails fluttered in the winds overhead and as her wooden prow cut through the gentle waters like a knife slowly slipping through cheese, their progress slow but steady and the horizon all around them free of ships, with not a single sign of a pursuer who might have come onto their course when they had passed through the pirates' forest of the Stepstones. Even still, the more martial members of the crew stayed alert, staying on the fore and aft castles of their ship and looking out across a blue sea bathed with the golden light of the afternoon sun with anxious movements, hatchets and long knives, the tools of a sailor's trade, not far out of reach, but his escorts, the first 3 men to come to the dragon banners once more, were more leisurely, more certain. Brandon, the northern warg, was by the port side of the ship, watching as his great and golden eagle circled above only to occasionally dip towards the ship's timbers to rest and to feed, as Viserys knew that this ship's holds were packed to the brim with grains and cheeses and other foods, making pests and the things that might feed on them abundant, and there was no easier meal for a bird of prey than a mouse that had not the first idea of how to escape an eagle's crushing talons, or a kind of seagull who had never once before had to deal with the threat of such a predator swooping down on them at such great speed. The occasional sight of their half-eaten remains littering the deck were proof enough of that. But whilst the skin changer contented himself with leaving his bird to hunt and watch and occasionally taking control of it himself so that he might see their surroundings from the skies above in the way that only the dragon riders of old had once done, watching the waves with an eagle's eyes, Tyrion Lannister was quietly pacing about, arms crossed, armed and armored for battle, deep in whatever thoughts were his own. There was no doubt in Viserys' heart that Tyrion was a loyal man and true, for he had been given every opportunity to fell the last of the Targaryens through their journey from Pentos, every opportunity to capture them both and take them to the usurper atop his stolen throne in King's Landing, to send them to a wretched end in the Black Cells or to have their heads put atop the gates as a symbol of one last, final victory over the true and rightful ruler of the 7 kingdoms. No, Tyrion was surely loyal, no matter how little he might seem to be at ease with their journey, that Viserys was certain. But of the sellsword Bronn, dicing with the crew below decks, he was less certain. Mercenaries, no matter how noble they might appear or how they seemed to appear at the time in which they were needed most, were never to be trusted. His father had told him that during the usurper's revolt, saying to the court why it was that he refused to hire sellswords to expand the royal army during the war, and for good reason, what good were sellswords if they promised to strike down one's enemy only to turn upon their former master due to receiving more gold from the other? Such beams of logic and reason that his father so often gave was proof that he was not the mad king the traitors said he was, iron, perhaps. Lawful. Certainly. But never mad. Never. Once he had his throne, however, he would make sure that such blatant lies would be struck from all the realm's chronicles and history tomes, so that his family's name, so that his father's name would not be besmirched by such filth. But first the rebels would have to be dealt with, and none more so than the Baratheons, who owed their very existence to the Targaryens and who had been spared a traitor's punishment for their rebellion barely a century before in the days of his great-grandfathers. Rule out of nothing but the love by which the Targaryens had for their cousins who had turned their backs on them twice before. He could easily have Robert Baratheon, the usurper himself, sent to the rack and made to endure a lifetime of torment, but Viserys would be a generous and noble king, as his father had been, and would give him a chance to take the black, to allow him to contemplate a lifetime of treachery whilst carrying out the honorable duties of the Night's Watch, or failing that, a swift end on the block, just as he would for all the others. But first, there was the matter of taking back his throne, and seeing his sister-wife back to the castle they had been forced to leave so long before, so the dream of justice would have to wait, and so he turned his attentions to his sister-wife, his queen, making sure that she was all right, as a good husband and a good king should. "Are you well, Daenerys?" he asked, walking over to his sister, his wife leaning onto the wooden railings of the starboard side of the ship. "You have said little today." "I feel seasick," she said quietly and with a pale face, one hand on the railing and the other over her upset middle. "I don't like sailing." "Don't worry, sweet sister," he said with a reassuring smile and a quiet, gentle voice. "We will be at Volantis soon, and once we are there you won't need to go on a ship till we take back our throne, and then you won't ever have to sail again if you do not wish it." "Truly?" "Truly," he said with a nod. "If my queen does not wish to sail, then we will not sail." Daenerys smiled, then, however weakly it might have been. Ever since their wedding, ever since their bedding, the two had grown closer, much so, and Viserys felt as though his sister was becoming more comfortable with the role that she was to have at his side, as his wife and as his queen, a gentle and soft-throated woman with love for all. She had started to lose much of the tongue-etted silences that he knew she had gone through ever since she was little, now that he not only allowed her to speak freely, but encouraged it, the woman who would help rule the Seven Kingdoms at his side, just as how their mother had always told him how she helped their father, would need to be able to speak boldly and proudly in order to be able to dominate the court when he was away or sick, just as she would need to in order to win the affections of young maidens the realm over, so that all of Westeros would love his Daenerys just as much as he did. Such was how his mother and father had their marriage, and so it would be how he would have his. So he said, leaning close to stand alongside his lady wife, smiling and warm and trying to take her mind from the voyage and from the motion of the waters beneath their ship, as any good husband would. "What will you do first, once we take the Red Keep?" "I am not sure," she answered, thinking. "Maybe I will look at the dragon skulls. From what I know, the usurper has taken them down," Viserys said, putting an arm around his wife and holding her close against his side. "But once we have our throne, I will have them put up on the walls again." His sister smiled, then. "Are they really as big as you say they are?" "Bigger," he said, his voice as gentle as he could make it. "And none are bigger than Balerions." His was always over the Iron Throne, with Vigors to his left and Meraxes to his right. "I want to see them when I can," his sister said, hopeful. "And you will," he said, his words as much an encouragement as they were a promise. He would never allow the usurper and his brood to keep the throne that was by all the rights of gods and men meant to be his, no matter how long the struggle might take. "And if the Volantens hear us, then mayhaps we might go home sooner than we thought." "Do you truly think they will help us?" his wife asked, hopeful. "None of the Magisters ever did." "Until we met Iliomapatis," Viserys answered, squeezing her hand. "Our fortune is looking up, sweet sister. Barely a year ago it was just you and me and barely enough coin to feed ourselves with, but now we have 2 knights of our own, the first men to come back to our side, and more coin than we need to live well, if perhaps not enough to buy an army. We're closer than we have ever been. All we need now is help, and we are not nearly as helpless as we were before, and the Volantens are our cousins. They will help us if we give them a reason to, since we helped them against the 3 daughters a century ago." "Who were the 3 daughters?" his sister asked, curious and lacking the teachings that a maester had given to her brother, even if he had taught her everything he knew about words and sums. "Were they queens, too?" "They were queens, but they were cities, not women," Viserys said with a teasing voice, making his sister-wife laugh. Lys and Tioche had allied together not long before the Dance of the Dragons, to drive the Volantens from the disputed lands, but they kept their alliance together and used their strength to claim the Stepstones, clearing out the pirates so as to take the Isles for themselves. They put a toll on every ship that passed through, which led to Daemon Targaryen invading the islands with the support of the Iron Throne and a Valyrian fleet. Then, the Dance of the Dragons happened, Viserys continued. Sir Otto Hightower, an ambitious lord who wanted to use the power of the Iron Throne for his own ends, convinced the three daughters to make war on the Blacks, Queen Rhaenyra's side. They accepted, and they attacked the Valerius and destroyed their fleet before sacking Driftmark and destroying Spicetown, but they lost most of their ships in doing so, and they never really recovered. The Volantens, who had been asking for our help as a way to make amends for King Aegon's attack during the Age of Blood, took the opportunity to claim their vengeance. Viserys finished with a smile. We gave them coin to help with their advance, and sent our own fleets to blockade Lys and Teosh so as to cut them away from their ally. Volantis won, and their return to prominence and the bleeding of the three daughters made the alliance collapse. Now Volantis is one of the mightiest of the free cities again, with them, Myr and Braavos all vying for first. Volantis is strong for more than that, Tyrion Lannister said as he walked over, keeping out their titles in order to help keep their true identities a secret. They've been gaining strength for years, since all the wealth of the Jade Sea that goes on to Westeros has to pass through their ports first, and half the world gets its sugar from Volantis too. That's how they had the strength to smash Qohor. How did the Qohorics lose? His little sister asked. I thought they were guarded by the Unsullied. They were, Tyrion said. But the Unsullied aren't invincible. They are tough, but they don't adapt well. They are taught not to, and they don't object to orders even if they are mad, so when Volantis started winning the Qohorics had no idea how to respond and threw the Unsullied away for a loss of what to do with them. Besides, Tyrion shrugged. Any Westerosi knight can kill any Unsullied. They geld them so they are not tempted by women, but doing that means they end up losing much of their muscle the same way a castrated horse does, and it takes the fire out of them as well. Excellent guards. Terrible fighters. Do you know anything about the way that Volanten men make war? War galley ahead, came Brandon's voice, loud enough to be heard, the crew's attention snapping towards him in an instant. They are sailing on a western course. Won't be long before they see us. Looks too proper to be a pirate galley. How in the name of the gods do you know that? Asked one of the crew. I just do. Brandon smiled as he extended his right arm, his eagle swooping down and onto his vambrace, picking at its feathers with a golden beak. A not-so-little bird told me. Aye, but he's telling the truth. The captain, a Pentoshi sailor named Malo whose dark hair was turning silver with age, said as he peered to the east with a Mirish eye, a long tube of bronze with a pair of glass lenses at either side. I see a war galley flying a violet sail and rowing as well. They must be in a hurry. Will they attack? Viserys asked, quickly, hand finding the pommel of his longsword, an old weapon that he had trained with for year on year at King's Landing when he was still but a boy. Are we in danger? I couldn't tell if they were pirate or otherwise without getting too close, Brandon said. It might be that they are just a patrol. Or it might be that they are a pirate. Malo sighed. We stand little chance if they are. But they might simply be a patrol ship, as he says, I can't tell from here. Then, in the distance, Viserys heard the unmistakable sound of drums, echoing off the waters, like distant thunder. The men readied themselves for battle, bringing up crossbows and shortbows and whatever tools they might have which could be used as weapons, axes and hatchets and oars and even a few falchion-like swords made for chopping through rope. But Viserys knew that the only men on the ship able to fight well were his knights and himself, and only they were armored. He marched to the other side of the deck, leaning over the railing to see the two-decked warship coming closer, closer, purple sails billowing in the winds as 100 oars rolled into the waters and out again in their spiral pattern, pushing the ship towards them inch by inch and foot by foot. Immediately he turned about and threw his cloak around the shoulders of his sickly sister-wife, holding her hand for a moment and squeezing tightly to give her strength as he did up her hood and turned away to face the other side of the ship once more, hand on grip and ready should the intentions of the other ship be anything other than noble, and so he waited, with the others, ready, and he felt the approach of the war galley and the ripples it made in the water through his boots before it. Saw it up close. And he saw on its prow a glittering golden figure that was none other than the dragon, its wings spread and sweeping back to the ship's timbers. He blinked at the sight, staring, and his gaze was only broken by the sudden bang of a grapnel striking the hull and its clattering as it was pulled across the deck to hook onto the railing, followed by another, then another, then another, and then a boarding ramp. He swallowed hard, his brow beginning to dampen with a mixture of sea mist and sweat. It was surely not any of the usurper's dogs, for none would sail with the dragon's head on its prow, and sails that were in the iconic color of the Volantens made it certain that it was from their destination. But what reasons would they have for stopping a single, lowly merchant ship on its way to them? Would they be willing to hand over the Targaryen exiles to the usurper, when everything was going so well? He hoped and prayed otherwise, or for at the very least that they would not be recognized for who they were. Viserys had made sure to hide all the crests and sigils that might mark them as the rightful rulers of Westeros from the moment they had left Illyrio's manse, even going so far as to hide the dragon eggs beneath a layer of clothing so that they would not be found. Then there was the sound of heavy, armored boots walking across the deck of the great warship besides them, Tidette and Brandon readying themselves for a fight should their blades be needed. And instead of being met with swords, they were met with words. "Hail and well met," said a clear and soft voice, bearing the smooth tones of a man of high birth, its speaker revealed as he stood on the side of the Volanten warship. He bore the Valyrian look, of silver hair that reached down to his shoulders and eyes of a dark amethyst, high-cheeked and hard-jawed and covered in a swaying hauberk that was made of metal scales instead of rings, colored all the shades of blue and white of foaming sea water, covered by a mantle of turquoise wool clasped with a golden tiger facing a dolphin atop an anchor. "I am Aena Tineris of Volantis, captain of the Lyria." "Who is the captain of this vessel?" "I am Maelo," answered quietly, wary of provoking the Volantens as a group of Volantene troops appeared besides their captain, protected with the same sea-colored armor as their commander but carrying powerful bows instead, with quivers on their hips fletched with blue and white. "Why have you boarded us so suddenly and without warning?" "We carry no